Joseph Garibaldi, you will see, a knight who honours all of Italy, more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch. Of medium height, broad-chested and with wide shoulders, robust and graceful at the same time, he gives you the impression of strength and agility. Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography die of Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by G.B. Cuneo, Deputy Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Damaso, already in Favelle in Dora Grossa. With an open chivalrous soul to all manifestations of beauty, music and poetry have a magical empire over him. Severely he frowns at the first glance, and they give him an imposing air, the smooth and straight beard, the long blonde hair, and the broad forehead from which a straight line descends and forms with his nose, falling perpendicularly, and his piercing and acute gaze, but fixing him. A dear harmony of lines and shapes jumps out at you as expected before you, and a feeling of trust and sympathy suddenly arises in your soul and mixes with the respect that first inspired you. Tales of honourable deeds and acts of charity in favour of the unhappy exalt him powerfully, but what predominates above everything else in him is his devotion to Italy and national honour. Consistency in adversity, growing courage in proportion to obstacles and dangers, firmness in deliberation, a keen eye that seldom fails even in the most terrifying moments, and serenity in all circumstances of life, are equally qualities that distinguish him among his contemporaries. He saved the threatened wood from impending danger, thanks to the courage and prompt advice of that 13-year-old boy. With the germs of these virtues, a feverish action, and a battlefield, he launched himself into the sea, which from the shores of his native Nice he had so many times contemplated, disrupted by storms, with a kind of pleasure, eager to confront those furious waves and conquer them. And he began to prove his unyielding spirit and his keen insight, still an adolescent, one day, when, finding himself on the shore between Nice and Villafranca, he jumped into the waves to help some companions who had embarked on a raft that, due to a sudden gust of wind, seemed about to capsize. He sailed to the Levant and the Black Sea. He touched various Italian ports, and from one of these, in his early years, he went to see Rome, which left a deep impression on him. Naturally inclined towards study and practice, he also combined book learning. Therefore, the pain within him was immense when, thinking about what Italy was and still could be, he saw it as a miserable prey to the stranger, and, moreover, insulted by those who had always been instruments of our ruin. Anger and pity assailed him at the same time, and these deeply felt affections were strengthened by the teachings of a Sardinian brother consul in Philadelphia, who from his distant land did not cease to remind the beloved Giuseppe of their Italian heritage, and how they should live as such, perhaps fearing that the proximity of France and the perverse tendencies of some might lead him astray. A strong inclination towards the Greeks and their popular songs, of which he often remembers with desire and affection the harmonies and verses, remained in his heart, a fruit of those travels and of the remembrances of his early studies. During his travels to the Levant, struck by illness, he had to stop in Constantinople, where he met the family of the exile Colosso, becoming friends with them. Cured and finding himself without means, he offered himself as a teacher of calligraphy, Italian and French language. Thus he provided for his necessities until, after a fortunate encounter, he resumed his interrupted maritime career. Meanwhile, as the time approached when Italy was to attempt once more, and in vain, to overcome its adverse fate, Garibaldi joined forces with the generous ones, whose indifference the many did not deter. And from what I gather from some of his verses, it was precisely in Taganrog, before the Cossack servants, as he wrote, that he was initiated into the sublime mysteries by a believer in youth. There on the Pontic ice he swore to die for his homeland, nor had any man ever strived with greater devotion to fulfill his solemn oath. Upon the discovery of the 1833 conspiracy, the patriots prepared to regroup and revive their shattered ranks not too far in the future. Later, when even the attempt by Savoy failed, and those who had been involved in aiding him were compromised within. Garibaldi, who had offered himself as a volunteer in the Navy for the better cause, just 1 month earlier, could only find salvation in flight. On the night of January 3rd to 4th, 1834, an insurrection was planned in Genoa. News from Savoy received in time, and other unexpected events fortunately suspended every movement, but all this did not happen without giving clear indications to the police of the failed attempt, so that many of the conspirators managed to escape her. Some were arrested. Garibaldi sought refuge with a kind peasant woman who provided him with rustic clothes. Disguised, he left the city the next day and made his way into the mountains. From mountain to mountain, only rarely stopping at the huts of the mountain people to shelter from the cold alpine nights or ask for a piece of bread, after many days he secretly entered his parental home in Nice, rested for a while and embraced his loved ones. He then left for France. He finally saw behind him the waters of the Var. Overwhelmed, from the foreign shore he gazed at his native land. After facing countless dangers and hardships, he felt a more vivid and intense love welling up within him, a love that would cease with his life. Perhaps it was due to the acquaintances made at that time that he recently made the decision to go to that country, seeking refuge there, which his ungrateful homeland refused him. A beautiful moment in Garibaldi's life took place in Marseille, which deserves to be recounted here. To refugees fleeing Italy to French territory, the government of Louis Philippe not allowing them to choose their place of residence, Garibaldi was sent to Dragnano, where he was under surveillance by those authorities. But unable to bear that state of idleness for long, he disappeared and went to Marseille, from where a little later he set out on other voyages on French ships, and once he went officially aboard a frigate to Tunis, which the Bey had purchased in France. However, he was sought after by the family of the rescued, who, if we recall correctly, was one of the most powerful in that city and a general of an army, and finally found, they made him offers of rewards, protections, and endless thanks. Garibaldi accepted with affection the warm handshake from that grateful family, and thanked them with dignity for their offerings, which he felt offended by. He found himself on board at that port, and suddenly a noise as if announcing a disaster rose from the crowd of people. Garibaldi looked, and saw in the sea a struggling young man with the waters, close to succumbing. And no one among the onlookers dared to rescue that victim from death. It was an instant, and he had already seized that dying man before others noticed him, and they were barely recovering from their astonishment when this sorrowful figure found himself safe on shore. But Garibaldi had disappeared. The hope of events that had seemed close had kept him in Europe for some time, but this hope having vanished later, he undertook a trip to America and arrived at the port of Rio de Janeiro for the first time in 1836. There he formed friendships with some Italian exiles who had been forced from their homeland by adversity, and with their help he was able to purchase a small sailboat, with which he practiced for 9 months in the humble trade of coastal shipping between Rio de Janeiro and Cabo Frio. Another deed similar to those of Nice and Marseille was carried out by Garibaldi in Rio de Janeiro. Of dragging out such a useless existence for our land, of having to do this work, certainly we are destined for greater things, we are out of our element. In these fugitive journeys, Luigi, my always warm and affectionate companion from Genoa, a Rossetti who later, fighting in the province of Rio Grande for the Republic against the Brazilian Empire, fell as a valiant warrior overwhelmed by numbers, leaving solemn testimony to Italian virtue on those solitary and unknown fields in America. That life afflicted him bitterly, not so much because he was disheartened by the work in which he engaged, but indeed we have seen him go proudly to earn his bread through extremely hard labours, yet always with honour, but that busying himself in commerce, where he applied his activity and intelligence, did not correspond to the needs of that most ardent soul, so that from Cabo Frio on December 27, 1836, he wrote, Of me I will tell you only that fortune does not favour me, and what afflicts me is the idea of being unable to advance anything for our affairs. I am tired, God. A black man was not for Garibaldi any less a brother than a white. A poor black man had fallen into the sea amidst the ships, while a furious wind raising the waters made them crash into each other, rendering it extremely dangerous to attempt to aid that unhappy soul and Garibaldi. Seeing the many curious yet indifferent spectators, careless of his own life, dove into the boiling sea, and with a strong hand seized the black man, dragging him safely onto the shore. The Republican insurrection of Rio Grande against the government of Rio turning into war, which then lasted for approximately 10 years, had suffered a terrible blow almost from its beginning in the defeat of the Fanfa Island. That same Zambicari, after enduring and fighting for freedom in America, came to contribute to the national war, earning the country's gratitude in Bologna, Venice, Ancona, and now in exile, where English persecution makes it more bitter and honoured. The leaders of that movement, although under the guise of surrender, were arrested and sent to the prisons of Rio de Janeiro. Among them was our friend Livio Zambicari, one of the main proponents of that movement, and then secretary and companion of General Bento Goncalves da Silva, the overall commander of the Rio Grandense army. Garibaldi, upon contacting Zambicari and Bento Goncalves, who had also been imprisoned, conceived a plan to arm his small fleet with the Rio Grandense flag and sail against the enemy sea for the imperialists. Indeed, he left Rio de Janeiro equipped with necessary documents from the insurrectionist government, and soon took control of a Brazilian boat, hoisting the Republican banner on its mast. Upon learning of their actions, the government immediately sent a large armed ship to capture them. With that, he headed towards the Eastern Republic, which the insurgents believed to be favourable to them. However, upon arriving in Maldonado, they found no welcome, so they went near Montevideo, first sending a messenger to inquire about the government's intentions. As they approached, not seeing Garibaldi, who gave the combined signal that they were friends, he prepared to fight. The firing began, and on the first shots he fell backward. On the flooded deck of his blood, a bullet had hit him in the neck. Garibaldi, mortally wounded, was entrusted Dr. Ramandilarca, native of that land, if we are not mistaken, who, during the long and difficult illness, devoted the most affectionate care to the patient, saving Italy this important life with the noblest disinterest. But with his health, our friend did not regain his freedom. He was still held for a long time in that country where he could walk freely. He lived hospitably hosted by a Spaniard settled there. The crew, thus left without guidance, and sensing the strong wind blowing from the Levant, moved away from danger, fleeing to the opposite side. And they ran so far that, entering the Peron, they dropped anchor before Golegui, a small town in Entre Rios, where, not considering the government's papers valid nor willing to recognize the new flag, everyone was put in prison. The ball that had struck him entered from the left side under the ear, crossed the neck, and stopped beneath the skin of the right ear. Besides this wound, his right arm was scratched by bullets in 2 or 3 places. Andreas, who came to love Garibaldi with the passion of an admirer, so much had he understood the greatness of that noble soul. Before seeing her tremble under the rod of the Vandal, the testimony of conscience is enough for us. Then, inspired by that faith which never left him, he would say, "My fate is linked to yours, guided by a single principle, dedicated to a cause. We have renounced tranquillity and imposed silence on all passions. In spite of the light and unconsidered judgments of the multitude, which often do not concern our generous purpose, that under the guise of interested contemplations, or ambition, we will continue." But this calm was not to be allowed to last longer, as the local authorities received orders to have him translated to the capital, a fact communicated to him on the eve of his departure, as the night had already advanced. And about his captivity, Garibaldi wrote, "As for escaping, Suffice it to know that I am in this condition, on my honour's word. I spend most of the day reading books that the unwearied kindness of my host provides me. Sometimes in the evening of a fine day I go for a walk, visit some acquaintances, and gaze sorrowfully at the beauties of the town, and return home. At other times I go out to enjoy a beautiful morning, and read or write, and always in my heart Italy. And speaking with scorn I cry, I would have her desolate, and her broken palaces. I will keep silent, he wrote. About the adventures of these days of flight, I was arrested and brought back to Galloway, fearing that Garibaldi might seek to seize him, and given the changed circumstances, for which he had given his word, not to escape. He considered himself freed from his own side, and attempted that very night to save himself from the persecutions he suspected. He roamed through those fields unknown to him for 2 days. And that cruel torment made a wild crowd, gathered at the open prison door, even more abhorrent and atrocious, deriding the sufferer, and using his martyrdom as a subject for slander. Here I should finish, and not remember what made me suffer at the hands of a monster, but I will give you his name, so that you can mark him for the scorn of the universe. Yes, Leonardo Millen held one of your brothers for 2 hours by the hands. A barbaric torture left Garibaldi with an injured hand, which still causes him intense pain in certain atmospheric conditions after 12 years. Finally taken to Bajada, the capital of Entre Rios province, he was treated humanly, perhaps because the long imprisonment and suffering had persuaded that governor not to further cruelly mistreat a man who had in no way offended the laws of the country, where he had been brought near death. From Bajada he set sail for Montevideo, then to Rio Grande, where freedom was being fought for. The government of the Republic welcomed him with enthusiasm and entrusted him without doubt with the command of the few naval forces it had on Lago dos Patos. At the end of about 8 months of detention, perhaps weary of watching him or satiated with making him suffer, they left him the path open to leave that ill-fated land, which nevertheless did not plant hatred in Garibaldi's heart, only remembering the affection and sympathies of the good ones who mourned over the cruelties practiced against him. Without losing time, Garibaldi increased, brought discipline to those forces, and illustrated them with many honourable partial acts, as well as the Republican flag and his growing fame. It is not possible to narrate them in detail, nor is it possible to remain silent about the following events. A captain named Moring, with 120 men, unexpectedly attacked Garibaldi, who was in Camacuum with only 11, all Italians, including Rossetti. The surprised defenders showed such courage that the enemies fell dead, and the survivors had to flee. Upon reporting the incident to the government, Garibaldi proudly exclaimed, "1 free man is worth 10 slaves." On another occasion, Republicans advanced to capture the fortress guarding the mouth of Rio Grande from the north. With Rossetti and a small group, Garibaldi climbed up the walls as enemy fire rained down, and the defenders, astounded by their audacity, repelled them with cannon fire, allowing them to enter the fortress. However, the enemies did not dare resist further. But such valour was not matched by others, so they had no choice but to retreat. Later, the Republican government, intending to extend the revolution to the other provinces of the empire, offered assistance to that of Saint Catherine, which accepted. A column, known as Auxiliadora, headed towards Laguna, a town located in the aforementioned province, with a small port on the coast. Secretary of the general commander of the column was Rossetti, who later held or directed the government in Laguna, and Garibaldi as a powerful support for the enterprise. The town easily fell into the hands of the Rio Grandisi, and in a naval operation Garibaldi barely saved himself from drowning after the shipwreck of one of the large canoes under his command, while on that occasion his young Frendidoro Mutrug from Nice, a passionate lover of Italy and yearning for dangers to display Italian virtue, perished. And when day broke clear, the pursued ship did not appear. The tireless and cunning Ligurian had worked through the night, and successfully regained the port before his pursuers could realize it. They say that to better deceive them, he gathered a lot of wood and, in the darkness, set fire to it, implying that he had burned his ship and decided to seek refuge on land. The Empire, meanwhile, had gathered many naval forces to retake the lagoon and easily forced their way in, with their only defense being a battery poorly equipped for a significant resistance. Many warships entered the port. Firing with their many cannons, Garibaldi responded vigorously from his strongholds with his fearless wife, native to that land, by his side, whom he had recently taken as a heart companion. The activity and energy that distinguish him, Garibaldi, having entered the lagoon, equipped 3 small wooden vessels in a few days, the best that could be found in that port, and with these, poorly supplied with arms and ammunition, and unsuitable for combat due to their fragile construction, he sailed across the sea, disturbed enemy trade, captured 1 or 2 ships, and sent them into port. At the sight of imperial war sails he did not flee, skillfully maneuvering. He avoided collisions with the strongest vessels, and set fire to one using a lesser but still superior force. Left alone and pursued by all, he took refuge in a bay, ran his ship aground, disembarked the 2 cannons, and from an elevation where he placed them continued to bombard the enemy, who, having withdrawn for the night, waited not far away for daybreak. When he saw the desperate situation, he sent his men ashore and remained alone. He ordered them escorted to safety, set fire to the gunpowder, and with a terrifying explosion sent the ships into the air, diving into the waves at the same time and reaching shore by swimming. In one of the many battles, the wife fell into enemy hands, but the valiant woman did not accept the idle prison, and instead, upon receiving the false news of her husband's death, she studied and made plans so that at night she escaped from the watch of her guards. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of their enemies, the Republicans had to retreat, and Garibaldi, having organized his infantry, followed the column, held the campaign for a long time. Offering brilliant examples of intelligence and courage at every encounter, and one fine day he marked himself in the Battle of Lages, which was mentioned by the government newspaper. O Povo, in honor of our fellow citizen. The beloved husband, his face disfigured by repeated wounds. But finally reassured, after carefully examining those unburied bodies, she hurried to trace him through those vast and solitary fields. Eager to know if she had truly suffered such misfortune, her first thought was to go to the battlefield, where at every moment she trembled at the prospect of finding the beloved features, and to the unhappy one, leaning on the dawn with a fixed gaze on those still lying dead, it seemed, in a moment perhaps of mental aberration, to catch a glimpse. Ah! Amidst so many trials, they had a child, to whom, for the reverence Garibaldi holds for the men who died for Italy, he gave the sacred name of Menotti. The dangers and the terrible solitude did not hold her back. She ran, trusting in God and his love, which did not fail her, and after 2 days she was fortunate enough to reunite with the man she loved, and always loved with affection, of whom rare examples exist. After the extremely risky expedition to Cima da Serra, where his wife and the newborn followed him, putting themselves in the most frightening dangers and risks, Garibaldi did not stay long again in Rio Grande. And here we would like to honor the truth in our homeland, to remember that 2 Italian names stood above the others in the affection and reverence of the Rio Grande population, Zambicari and Garibaldi. From the Rio Grande, after those 5 years of arduous life, Garibaldi extracted, as his only treasure, his dearest wife and son, nothing else. So, upon arriving in Montevideo, his first concern had to be finding a way to support himself and his family. Seeing things going astray, and no longer supported by the cause of the Republic, he thought to withdraw from that field, where the war of principles seemed to be replaced by a war of individual ambitions, and around mid-1841 he moved with his family to Montevideo, leaving Rio Grande and those in Brazil who loved the Rio Granden's cause, with honourable renown and grateful memory, and among everyone else a feared name, shrouded in the calumnies that parties are profligate in spreading throughout the world, but all friends and enemies included, admired for extraordinary valour. Avoiding living at the expense of others, and hating idleness, he did not spare any effort, nor did he leave any means untried, and he succeeded in providing for his loved ones. However, in a country consumed by war, it was not possible for him to remain long focused on studies and the cares of peace time. Among the various things he undertook, we note the algebra and geometry lessons he gave at certain hours of the day at the main college of that city. The study of exact sciences was always one of Garibaldi's favourite occupations. He was entrusted with 3 ships, a corvette, a brigantine, and a galette. With these he left Montevideo for Corrientes on the right bank of the Paran, in order to support the war plan against Rosas, coordinated between the governments of that province and the Banda Oriental. The government of Montevideo, which was aware of his warlike virtues and honourable character, had several times tried, in vain, to get him to enter the service of the Republic, but finally, yielding to the requests of friends, to his own inclination, and to the sympathy he felt for the justice of the cause, he took command of a part of the fleet. From that point he headed for the Paran, navigating laboriously through the thick banks that surround it, and upon reaching the vicinity of Goya, he ran entirely dry and became stranded there. It was here that the enemy fleet, with 10 sails and commanded by Admiral Brown, already renowned for his spectacular victories over the Brazilian squadron in the war against the empire supported by the Argentine Republic, reached him. Courageous by number, for the fame that accompanied him, and for the unfavourable position of the Eastern Fleet, Brown advanced almost sure of the prey, but the unexpected, well-ordered and sustained resistance against his attacks soon convinced him of the quality of the enemy he was facing. He faced the fire of the batteries of Martin Garcia Island, located at the only passage of ships, forced to almost brush against it due to a lack of water in the remaining river, and so skilfully and courageously did he act that some enemy's artillery pieces were disassembled in no time, and without damaging his other vessels, he remained with his ship at anchor to withstand all enemy fire, this passage considered extremely risky, which brought him and his exploits the praise of the country's newspapers and the gratitude of the government. The fierce fighting lasted for 3 days, without his opponents considering it necessary to stop, as if using a phrase from Garibaldi's report, to go at the assault, despite their considerable numerical superiority. Many members of the crew on those ships were Italians, and not a few precious lives of our fellow citizens were lost in that glorious battle, which honoured the flag of Montevideo so much. Among them we remember the officers Giuseppe Borzone from Chiavari and Valaga, both young, vigorous, and proven brave. Under the hail of enemy bullets, he rowed to shore, reached it at the precise moment where the infantry was lined up and ready to fire their muskets. However, he not only touched the shore, but, having ordered his men, pushed back the enemy infantry and made his way, after a long battle in such a manner, to gain the territory of Corrientes, taking the wounded with him. They arrived in that long battle with fewer bullets for the Eastern Fleet, and Garibaldi implored them, by cutting through the chains of the anchors and other iron tools. At night he launched torpedoes against the enemy squadron, which suffered no damage as the strong current of the river, which he occupied the upper part of, deflected them from their intended course. When all means to attack failed, he prepared and executed the embarkation of men in small boats, abandoned the no longer defensible ships, and blew them up by setting fire to the gunpowder. Garibaldi, out of respect for his grey hairs and his loyal and generous enemy, who had played a significant role in the most notable events in the history of the Plata republics, and who had even held the highest office in Buenos Aires for a time, was the first to rush to the Admiral's house. Brown would not allow his opponent to stay below in a gesture of courtesy, and soon after visited him in his modest home. The Englishman Brown, amazed by that defence, thereafter held Garibaldi in the highest esteem for his talents and valour, and wanted to prove it when, upon retiring to England, he docked and stayed in Montevideo for several days, because as soon as he arrived there, he sent a trusted messenger to Garibaldi, announcing his desire to visit him. Amazed at seeing such a robust figure, especially at such a young age, the admiral warmly shook his hand and praised him with heartfelt words for his battle on the Paran and other lesser acts during the naval war. The imminent dangers made Garibaldi a desired figure in Montevideo, and many of the most enthusiastic among the young people of that noble city awaited him eagerly to join him in the defence that was being prepared. After that unhappy but honourable expedition, Garibaldi returned to Montevideo with his men several months later by land, and he arrived just as the army surrounding that city was about to invade the Oriental Republic. With Garibaldi, they said, "Either we win or we die honourably." As soon as he arrived, the government tasked him with organizing a fleet of fast ships, the only ones left to him from his original and thriving sea squadron. It's not to be underestimated the effort he put into this task, in short order. Exceeding the government's expectations, and much better than anyone had anticipated given the scarcity of resources, he presented the fleet ordered and ready. In response to this barbaric threat, all the residents of Montevideo, alarmed, asked for arms from the government to prevent any harm. It is known in Italy how those brave fellow citizens vigorously defended the cause they had embraced, and how they raised the Italian name to honour in those lands. The numerous Italians living in that capital, having requested and obtained Garibaldi as their leader, formed a legion of approximately 800 men and placed themselves under the orders of the government. During this time, the besieging army had positioned itself almost beneath the city walls, and its leader, General Oribe, aware of the terror his name inspired and of the foreigners' sympathy for the cause of the Eastern people, sent a circular to the consuls in those early days, threatening to treat as enemies any foreigners who, by means of arms or their influence, aided those he was about to fight against. In 1,000 encounters, the value of our conduct under Garibaldi shone forth brightly, and in particular he distinguished himself in the events of Cerro, de las Tres Cruces, de la Boyada. The event at Cerro was, if we are not mistaken, the first time that the Italian Legion could truly demonstrate what it later achieved for that republic. At that time, a detachment of legionaries, joined by other units, at Cerro, the mountain opposite Montevideo, on the western side of the bay, which serves as a port to that capital under General Borzai's command, was intent on driving the enemy from certain positions they had seized. The troops had already valiantly engaged several times, yet they resolutely continued their efforts to expel them, and despite his obstinate stay there, he showed no signs of wanting to leave. Garibaldi, having calculated everything, suddenly realized the point where he could strike the enemy with a decisive advantage, and after some hesitation, finally opened his thoughts to the general, asking him to be entrusted with that mission, which the general approved. A strong punch of enemy troops had been placed in a ditch from where they were able to terrorize without being attacked. Not far from there a house stood, from which the Italians were about 100 steps away, and the rest was open field. And we notice it as well to make the noble character of Garibaldi always clearer, that the resentment and anger excited in him by the baseness of those who would offend him, he turns against his enemies, never against individuals who, whether for political faith or fraternal bond, should hold him in higher regard than anyone else. We have spread out around this fact to notice a circumstance that is useful to note for Italy, on the assumption that, well known as certain of its supposed friends are, and finally nauseated by shameful foreign loves, It will want to think about providing for itself dignaneously first and foremost for its honour, supreme among goods, then for other vital issues from which its happiness and strength depend, but all subject to the most important one of national honour, without which freedom, independence, and everything are nothing or a shame. Garibaldi, presenting himself to the legionaries, said, "We must go to that house without firing a shot." And he led the enemy, having guessed the purpose, furiously rained musket fire on the bold group as it hurried towards the house, and despite a moment later, sheltered behind those walls, Garibaldi reorganized all his healthy companions safely. "Now," he said, with bayonets lowered to the ditch. At these words, like the snap of a spring, the small, compact phalanx advanced to the indicated point, and fell upon it with such force that the enemy began to falter on that side in such a way that he jumped along his entire line, thus presenting a favourable moment for the Montevideans, who, seizing the opportunity, repelled them, capturing many prisoners. Whenever, on the 1st of April, 43, the Italians requested arms in Montevideo, a Frenchman, following the custom of his countrymen, made it known to the government and general, in chief, powers that the Italians were capable, not of anything else, but of attacking from behind at night and by treachery, and therefore time and money for their organization, as well as confidence in valid assistance, would amount to nothing, and he could affirm this, he continued, from his experience with our people. To what extent it had already become clear soon after that the Italian legion was superior to that of the French can be seen from the day of the Passo di la Boiada, when General Paz, with the intention of attempting an extremely bold move that could have partly changed the course of the war, it had been equally supported by all, chose as his companions in the most daring faction of that day several corps, among them the Italian legion commanded by Garibaldi and Anzani. Meanwhile, on the other side, the French legion, left in its usual entrenchments and far from the fervour of the fray, was terrorized on that very day at the appearance of a group of cavalry. So many died fleeing, struck in the back, and many others took precipitous steps to seek salvation in the city, leaving their assigned position nearly deserted. No, unfortunately the general's plan did not achieve the outcome he had proposed, for reasons that it is not our duty to enumerate here, but we cannot omit to say that in the Passo di la Boiada, Garibaldi, with valour and intellect, marvellously supported by his men, contributed powerfully with other bodies to give a day of glory to the arms of the Republic. They were the French villainy exactly reported by Garibaldi from people whose authority one could not deny, but he had too much sense and too much generosity, and those who confided in him well knew it, to not realize that, facing an enemy everyone was preparing to fight, any personal resentment between men fighting for the same cause must be silenced. Thus, checking his just indignation, he secretly contradicted and soon discredited the French calumniator with deeds, by which the Italian name honourably rose in those lands, and only at the expense of the common enemy, hoping to also humble those proud ones over time, when a comparison could be established between the Italian and French legions in Montevideo. It is therefore not to be said with what fervour he seized that first opportunity at Cerro to give the Oriental Republic proof that the Italians had been shamefully calumniated. We remember hearing on that day the Italian legionaries, who had seen their colonel emerge unscathed from that hail of bullets, repeating in a mixture of astonishment and jest that he frightened away the deadly lead with a flick, as one does with flies. The battle of Las Tres Cruces was extremely bloody for both sides. A colonel named Nara, having advanced too far toward the besiegers of Montevideo, fell from his horse after being hit by a rifle shot. Garibaldi, upon learning of this, immediately ordered some of his men to retrieve the fallen man, believing him to be wounded, but the enemy, who had gathered in strength at that point, also sent larger forces to resist. A fierce battle ensued. Garibaldi, setting an example and using his voice to inspire the Italians, urged them to hold their ground to prevent the wounded comrade from perishing. The numerically superior enemy refused to yield. The memories of that time recorded the enemy's losses as significantly greater than those of the Italians. This fact will show how, in times of danger, comrades in arms can rely confidently on their chief's support. Of the 150 of our men, a quarter fell, either dead or wounded. Honour would not allow anyone to retreat. But Garibaldi, after pushing his men to make a final effort, saw the enemy retreat and then flee, which was not spared by the furious soldiers' bayonets. There are many other brilliant military feats in this man's life, equal to or more splendid than these, but we preferred them because they reveal not only courage and military talent, but also the temper of a generous spirit, a quality that above all others we venerate. In the history of the Italian Legion in America, whoever one day compiles it will be able to relate, calmly and one by one, the exploits in which Garibaldi distinguished himself so meritoriously. Meanwhile, without contradicting our purpose, we will narrate some others, especially that of February 1846 in the field of St. Anthony, where he demonstrated extraordinary military skill and incredible audacity. During his journey from Montevideo to Salto, he occupied the colony, landing for the first time with the Italians, who fought alone against the enemy on that day, and later reported by French newspapers as having sacked the occupied city. Garibaldi was sent by the government with a division consisting of various bodies and part of the Italian Legion to Salto, a city located near the Brazilian border, in order to defend and clear that territory from enemies he encountered and defeated repeatedly, finally expelling them from that province. There he was attacked several times by the enemy with a lot of artillery and superior forces, but always in vain. We have already defended the Italian Legion in a published writing in the Livornese Corriere II, demonstrating how instead French soldiers were the authors of the scandals in the colony. Leaving this city to Colonel Battle, who continued to defend it bravely, they finally reached Salto. On that day, February 8th, he had left with 184 Italian legionaries and some cavalrymen to protect General Medina, who with a small number of soldiers had to retreat to Salto. As soon as he reached a league away, he found himself surrounded by 1,500 enemies, against whom he was forced to fight, as surrendering or making peace to save his life was not in Garibaldi's nature. The unequal conflict lasted for 8 hours, fiercely and obstinately. On that day, Garibaldi fought like a soldier, often pointing his rifle at the overwhelming numbers. The enemies advanced as if towards an easy prey, and Garibaldi let them come close so that no shot could miss. Only when a short distance separated him from the 300 infantrymen who were marching on him did he order a volley, which halved the overconfident enemy. He did not allow a parliament sent by the enemy to approach him, preferring the beautiful death on the battlefield to life bought with armistice and cowardly transactions. His hearers heard him throughout that time of fire, urging them to remember Italy's honour compromised in that fight, and not to yield. And the powerful warning had the desired effect on these valorous ones. 35 perished at the scene, 50 were wounded, and by 9 o'clock that evening barely 100 stood, though most or nearly all were bruised and contused. In this deplorable condition, Garibaldi first turned his thoughts to the wounded, whom he placed on the remaining horses, and with the other comrades escorted during the retreat undertaken at that late hour. The short journey from Antonio at Salto, where they did not enter until around midnight, although the enemy, despite being defeated and weakened, still had a superior force in cavalry, he continued to harass them during their journey. The inhabitants of Salto welcomed these glorious ones with joy and as if in a trance, and their leader miraculously saved by his own virtue from so many enemies. Of these, 500 remained outside combat on that day, most of them perishing. At the same time that Garibaldi held command of the Italian Legion, he still retained command of the Eastern flotilla, and on many occasions used it to raid enemy commerce. in defiance of the blockade maintained by Brown's ships, which could not always prevent him from bringing prisoners into Montevideo harbour on ships that went to supply Orib. Moreover, this modesty has won you the sympathy of people apt to meritably appreciate what you have been doing over the past 6 months, among whom I will note first and foremost our plenipotentiary minister, who honours your character, and in whom you have a warm defender, especially when it comes to writing to Paris with the intent of destroying the unfavourable impressions that some articles in newspapers, written by people not accustomed to telling the truth even when narrating events that took place under their own eyes, might have generated. The French Admiral Lanier, also taken aback, wrote from his frigate, the Africaine, to General Garibaldi the following words, which we translate from the autograph in our power. I congratulate you, my dear General, on having so powerfully contributed with your intelligent and intrepid conduct to the completion of military deeds of which the soldiers of the great army would have been proud, which for a moment contained all of Europe. I congratulate you equally for the simplicity and modesty that make the reading of the report even more dear, in which you provide the most minute details of a fact of which you can without fear attribute all the honour to yourselves. Upon the announcement of this spectacular event, the government of Montevideo inscribed in gold letters on the flag of the Italian Legion these words, "The deeds of February 8th, 1846, by the Italian Legion under Garibaldi, and by decree, assigned to the same legion for all national army parades, the right side, a highly honourable distinction for Italian weapons, due to Garibaldi's valuable genius and courage, so valiantly aided by his compatriots." In writing to a friend in Montevideo, he proudly stated he would not give my name as an Italian legionary for the Golden Globe, a noble saying that was universally acclaimed and sublimated into a song which the Oriental poet Figaro dedicated enthusiastically to the defender of his homeland. Other times, with suitable manoeuvres, he facilitated merchant vessels that were transporting supplies to the besieged city entry into the fiercely guarded port by the Argentine fleet. Finally, wanting to engage in a battle one day, he went out with 3 small ships, the least aggressive of the fleet, with a determined spirit to attack the enemy, who was anchored at Montevideo's shore. 3 ships, the 25 de Marzo, General Eckig, and the Mapei with 44 cannons, made up Rosa's fleet. Garibaldi had just 8 small caliber guns, yet he advanced and positioned his ships in battle formation. On occasion, boarding at night with many legionaries in large launches, he set out determined to attack enemy ships, which were armed with large cannons, and he could not face during the day, but his daring scheme never came to fruition, because the enemy, aware of the terrible man they were dealing with, would raise anchor at night and move elsewhere. The enemy fleet, which had already unfurled its sails, turned its bows and sailed menacingly towards the bold ones approaching it. However, as they neared a distance that would have made combat inevitable, they changed course and distanced themselves. It is said that the commander of Rosas, unwilling to attempt the decisive experiment, as he drew near, saw it prepared for him by the bold enemy, and retreated from the field. Garibaldi intended to wait for the enemy, whom he believed would not hesitate to attack him superior in forces, and when close enough, strike at his flanks with a rush of bayonets, for he had on board a good number of determined legionaries, ready for that daring stroke. And in honour of Garibaldi, we wish to record on these pages a plan that well demonstrates the unyielding spirit of his intrepid mind. The terraces of Montevideo were filled with anxious and trepidating people. Sailors from numerous merchant and war ships of every nation stood marvelling as that unequal struggle began, but the enemy, retreating, left all astounded, while Garibaldi was accorded great glory and honour by those spectators, especially by the officers of the English, American, and French ships. The government of Montevideo dared not accept the proposal, and as an excuse for its refusal, it cited the fear of losing Garibaldi and his men, and with them a part of its most solid support. He proposed to the government of Montevideo, therefore, to embark the Italian legion in the fleet and sail with it as discreetly as possible towards Buenos Aires, and by night suddenly descend upon that city, rush to Rosa's house, attempt to arrest him, and call upon that oppressed and restless population to total freedom from their cruel persecutor. The coup planned by Garibaldi, where, as was likely, anticipating the people's frustration against Rosas, had succeeded, could have greatly accelerated, and to the benefit of the good, caused the end of that war, which, however, continues, with uncertain hopes of a prosperous outcome. Thus, the general set off for Montevideo, leaving that city fortified with a well-constructed fortress, a work attributable to the skill and activity of Colonel Anzani, and that population sad to lose their good friends and defenders. And here it is beneficial to remember a monument of pious remembrance that Garibaldi left in Salto, as he had already done during the naval battle on the Paran near Goya. The government of the Republic, considering it more convenient to have Garibaldi in the capital, recalled him from Salto, where he had not been disturbed or approached by enemies he had defeated in various encounters, as we previously mentioned, and of which they do not wish to remain silent. First, the encounter at Itapevi, where he defeated Colonel Lavalleja, taking 100 prisoners, 2 pieces of artillery, and leaving the family of the enemy leader in his hands, whom he immediately returned with a detail composed of those prisoners and a letter filled with polite and generous sentiment 6, and the other encounter on the banks of the Damon River against Colonels Lamas and Vergara, which he totally defeated. After taking care of the surviving companions from the Battle of San Antonio, it was his thought to gather the gloriously fallen bodies in that field and give them burial, which he indicated to the traveller with a very high cross that religion consecrated with its blessings. That cross bears these simple inscriptions. On one side 36 Italians died on February 8, 1846, and on the other one 84 Italians in the San Antonio field. However, he stayed in that place for a short time, becoming a source of envy and jealousy. Desiring rather to merit than to receive honours, he spontaneously renounced the coveted assignment. By September 46, they reviewed the capital, and the legionaries and Garibaldi, who at that time had no opportunity to render important services to the Republic, continued with the same zeal and affection to maintain order and keep the enemy away, until difficult circumstances led the government to entrust him with the supreme command of the garrison of the city, which he accepted after repeated requests and reluctantly. In those brief days when he held supreme command, one must not forget that, amidst the manipulation and countless baseness practiced by a few individuals, there was an attempt to incite a battalion of Negroes against his authority. These men, someone hastened to inform him, would do anything to rid themselves of him, and thus advised him not to expose himself to those enraged. "Stay, then, if you are afraid." Garibaldi would respond, and mounted on horseback, he would gallop alone, at that very moment, towards the rebellious battalion, which understood a few clear words from the general, acclaimed him with long live and affectionate salutes, disproving the calumnies and confounding the sad ones. Renouncing supreme command, the council and Garibaldi's support continued to be eagerly sought by the government in those circumstances, and there were not a few times when grave dangers threatened his existence, due to internal factions agitating restlessly. The following will demonstrate what we are about to narrate. What truly stands out in this man, besides his many rare qualities that we have been discussing, is his extraordinary aptitude for fighting valorously and skilfully on land and at sea. And even more remarkable is his disinterest and modesty that guide him in all his actions. He, not feeling presumptuous about himself, then wrote to the government, grateful for the honourable distinction, and renouncing that honour despite it, a renunciation that neither the government nor the assembly ever agreed to accept. General Rivera, having made a donation, which was accepted, of lands and livestock to a French legion formed in Montevideo, wanted to offer the same to the Italians, and Garibaldi, slightly taken aback by the gesture, replied with thanks without accepting the gift, observing that only as free men had the Italians taken up arms in that war, without any interests or personal ambitions. When the Assembly of the Republic wanted to solemnize the 3rd anniversary of the siege that began in March 1843, it did so by decreeing, among other things, several military promotions, and among those promoted was Garibaldi to the rank of general. I intend to speak of a man endowed with great courage and high military intellect, who has the right to your sympathy for the extraordinary events that took place in Italy, General Garibaldi. And to all these generous traits of character, we are pleased to add the following, which we derive from a recent writing of our esteemed friend, General Pacheco Y. Obes, Minister of the Eastern Republic in Paris. In response to detractors of his country, he pays the well-deserved praise to Garibaldi, soldier of that republic. In 1843, he says, "Mais," and to Lord Howden, the English minister sent for the pacification of the republics of the Plata, when he acceded to his invitation and went to see him in his rooms. After astute insinuations to dissolve the Italian legion with offers of compensation to the soldiers and leaders, he replied, "Haitians have taken up arms to defend the cause of justice, and this cause cannot be abandoned by honourable men," of which Lord Howden, a rigid supporter of the aristocratic party and distinguished scorner of all, well remembered in the turn of the peers in London in July 1849. When speaking of the men he had seen figure in those American disputes, pronounced from his seat these solemn words, which we take pleasure in preserving in our pages. The garrison of Montevideo was almost entirely composed of French and Italians, and was commanded by a man to whom I am happy to be able to bear witness that he was the only disinterested among a crowd of individuals who sought only their personal aggrandizement. He had friends among all the inhabitants of Montevideo. There was never a man more universally loved than him, and this was only natural. Garibaldi was always the first in battle, and equally adept at alleviating the horrors of war. 50 pataconi, 250 lire, this is the only sum Garibaldi received from the Republic. While he remained with us, his family lived in poverty. He was never dressed differently than the soldiers. Often his friends had to resort to tricks to change his worn-out clothes. Francisco Agel, one of the most respectable merchants of Montevideo, addressing himself to the Minister of War, informed him that in Garibaldi's house, the house of the leader of the Italian Legion, the leader of the national fleet, and finally, the man who gave his life every day for Montevideo, he made known to the minister that no light was kindled at night in that house, because in the soldiers' ration the only thing on which Garibaldi relied to live candles were not included. Tours, 100 pataconi, 500 lire to Garibaldi, who, considering half of this sum for himself, returned the other so it could be taken to the home of a widow who he believed needed it more. In 1844 a terrifying storm hit the Montevideo harbour. There was a sailboat which, after losing its anchors, was left in evident danger, with only one remaining anchor. On that ship were the families of the Carrillo gentlemen. When he went to government offices, it was either to request mercy for a conspirator or to ask for aid on behalf of some unfortunate person. And it is thanks to Garibaldi's intervention that Mr. Michiel Haedo condemned by the laws of the Republic where life is. General Garibaldi, informed of the danger, embarked with 6 men, bringing along another anchor, saving the sailboat. In Gualeguaychú he captures Colonel Villagra, one of Rosa's most ferocious leaders, and release him as well as his other companions. During his expedition inland he stood out for many instances of chivalrous generosity, which even today are a topic of conversation among both political parties. Point 7. The highest aspirations of our distinguished compatriot have always been to support and enhance the honour of the Italian name, and to fight for freedom wherever it was in danger. In the name of the new Pope, and the praises that had reverberated in those remote lands. He thought that the long-awaited man had appeared on earth, and like everyone else, he was deluded around that man. It is difficult to describe the impression that Italian news caused in Garibaldi's mind. While he was still in America, his face seemed to have taken on a new expression. His manners had become more urgent. He often paused over thoughts, and let slip a slight smile, as if waiting for a fortunate outcome. And while he intended to defend the rights of other peoples with his arm and heart, he did not forget his homeland, a continuous desire, and sigh of the solitary life of an exile. So he eagerly gathered, with an intoxicated and frenzied soul, the first voices of the new era that brought him news from this land to the American shore. With the English package that left yesterday, I transmitted the indicated sheet to Rome, so that the same sentiments may be excited in even higher breast. I feel it is my duty to inform you without delay that what she contains in Garibaldi's letter of devotion and generosity towards the reigning Supreme Pontiff is truly worthy of Italian hearts and deserves recognition and praise. As long as it is in support of the redeeming work of Pius VI, for a fortunate outcome, we and our companions will stand, whose name we speak, if we are given the chance to shed our blood. To which the nuncio replied on November 14th with this written answer, signed with his own hand, which we keep as an original in our possession. And heated by that delusion, he wrote from Montevideo, joined by our brave and noble friend, Cololanzani, to the Apostolic Nuncio Bedini in Rio de Janeiro, under the date of October 12th, with the following words that we find in that letter. If these arms, with some use of weapons, can be well accepted by His Holiness, we would much rather use them to the advantage of him who serves the Church and the homeland so well. Let them always be worthy of the name that honours them and of the blood that warms there. If the distance of an entire hemisphere can prevent taking advantage of noble offerings, its merit will never be diminished, nor will the satisfaction in receiving them be lessened. And he concluded with this prayer. Those who find themselves under his direction are, with this most sincere prayer, I accompany the best wishes, etc., this Bedini of the most sincere votes, and who in 1847 praised the Italian hearts, is the same one who later led the Austrian army to bomb Bologna for several days and destroy every seed of freedom there. It was acceptedly as a sign of happy success and as pledge of fraternal support in Italy that the offer was carefully accepted. Soon everything was ready for departure, but the government of Montevideo rose to hinder him from the long, sighing journey, which could not resign itself to the loss of such a man, and therefore the day of departure was indefinitely postponed. Now it was impossible for him to remain away from his homeland any longer, and he wonderfully fulfilled his desire to return there, and gave hopes of success to a project conceived long ago and cherished for many years, thanks to the extraordinary enthusiasm of the Italians living in Montevideo, who, inspired by the same spirit that had awakened a new life in their motherland, were overjoyed at the news of the first movements in Italy, raised to the highest hopes, and, driven by one of those impulses of generous hearts, never fail in crowds, when a great idea suddenly becomes clear to them, they had quickly collected a substantial sum through a national subscription for the expedition to Italy, commanded by Garibaldi. The delays incurred deeply afflicted Garibaldi, who every day lived in that inactive expectation tormented him like a reproach. It seemed to him that every day spent in a foreign land was a fault against the fatherland. Hence he used to repeat on this occasion, with an accent of profound sorrow, "We grieve that we will be the last ones to arrive, when everything will have ended." Unfortunately, our friend was not a prophet, and the pain which troubled his soul was a fate that should come from quite another, and indeed very bitter source. The hour has come when the government, reluctantly, assented to his request to lift anchor. The English commerce presented itself, asking him to remain for some time longer, as if his mere presence were enough to reassure the inhabitants and protect them from any enemy's attack, and to Garibaldi, from whom the English learned of the enormous daily expenses incurred by keeping the chartered ship for a longer period. They offered the necessary funds to cover them for many days. These finally elapsed, accompanied by 100 soldiers from the Legion and other volunteers 9. He finally set sail from Montevideo in April 1848. After a long voyage and 14 years of honored exile, he revisited and touched that beloved homeland, where he saw that flag-flying, for whose love he had been forced to flee at such a young age from his native soil, and lead a life of hardship in foreign lands. In the final moments before Garibaldi's departure from Montevideo, he received, among other signs of respect and affection, a deeply moving letter from the First Corps of that National Guard, signed by his valiant Colonel Tages and all the officers. It is impossible for us who have seen you and your companions share with us so generously and bravely all the trials of this war to remain indifferent to the void left by your absence. Receive these few words, they continued, as an imperfect tribute to the great services you have rendered to the independence and freedom of our fatherland. Generous words spoken by generous men, which brought tears of gratitude to Garibaldi's eyes. Garibaldi arrived first in Nice to embrace your mother and his wife with their children, whom he had sent a few months earlier to the paternal home, where they savoured a moment of domestic sweetness, and then hurried to Genoa by sea on the same ship, Esperanza, that had brought him and his companions from Montevideo. The reception in the strong and generous city was both for him and her worthy. But Garibaldi stayed only for a few moments, taking a narrow path to Turin, eager to act himself, as the war for independence had already begun. In the ways in which it was not sufficiently disguised that little account was being given to the patriotic offering, he was advised to go see the king, who was with his army around Mantua. However, the man who had been moved by America, consumed by the fever to fight for the glory and independence of Italy, found cold reception from the then ministry, and words that must have left a very sad impression on his mind, not greedy for anything but action, and convinced that this was enough to gain acceptance from men governing a fighting country against Austria, although he was not used to asking for anything, and found such requests repugnant. Garibaldi went to Rovabella and presented himself to Charles Albert. He wanted to fight and give his blood for Italy. This was his supreme need, and overcoming the obstacles that prevented him from entering the battlefield was still a form of combat, and advancing forward. The king welcomed him politely, and, with praises for what he had done in America, made him aware that his name was not unknown to him. Yet even Charles Albert, when Garibaldi explained the reason for his visit, left him in doubt, responding with vague words and inviting him to speak to the ministers. Perhaps he was dragged along against his will, and unaware of the fatal consequences that engulfed both the nation and himself in this misfortune that still weighs on us. We leave it to history to explain the many events that have taken place in the last 2 years, still shrouded in mystery, and to reveal how the late king, far from taking advantage of such enthusiasm, devotion to the fatherland, and a name already well known and dear to Italy, instead distanced himself, depriving the national war of such a powerful means of victory. They narrate that at that announcement he exclaimed with vivid emotion and evident joy, "Bravo, Garibaldi!" And if what we were told about King Albert is true, when, as an exile in Portugal, he heard of the defeat of the French army on April 30th under the walls of Rome, he must surely regret not having used such a brave and generous man in his war. Bravo, Garibaldi! Perhaps at that moment he rendered to his inner consciousness a tribute denied to slandered virtues, and the gall bitter which had been poured into him in Novara for a moment ceased to sour his soul, absorbed in the contemplation of avenged Italian honour. After useless wandering and losing precious time, Garibaldi finally arrived in Milan, where the Committee for Public Defence did not hesitate for a single instant to make use of the illustrious warrior, whom they immediately tasked with recruiting volunteers and forming a corps intended to defend the Bergamo province. In a short time, under the leadership's name, some 3,000 men gathered and were immediately dispatched to Brescia. In sign of affectionate remembrance to the comrade in arms who had shared dangers, hardships, and glories in America, Garibaldi named part of that body Battalion Anzani. Not yet having properly organized things in the aforementioned province, he was called in a hurry to Milan, which, due to adverse war fortunes, feared dire straits, which unfortunately materialized. Without hesitation, he responded to the call and quickly set off towards the threatened city. The enemy's fortune had been swift indeed. Garibaldi arrived in Monza, 12 miles from Milan, when the ill-fated announcement of the Salasco armistice revealed the most sorrowful state of affairs for us, as well as the immense stain that treachery and partisan spirit had inflicted on the Italian flag. He therefore spurned any truce, and feeling the right revive within him that belongs to every citizen to resist by all means, and in every way the destruction of his country or its shame, he constituted himself a champion of the Italian cause, strong in the mandate that the country entrusts to anyone who dares to assume it. And if, in the sad circumstances in which our fate was precipitated, it was not granted to him to raise it by his own efforts, lacking the necessary means for such a purpose, he nevertheless wanted to show, at least by example, how men of zealous national honor should yield to adverse fortune. Garibaldi, who had seen such a flourishing army, and soldiers running eager as to a feast of battle, and rejoicing at the thunder of artillery, and facing death with so much valor, suspected that armistice to be a plot by a few cowards, and his highly Italian spirit and jealous regard for the honor of his name made him refuse to yield to such an injury, and preferred to face death with his few faithful men, rather than shamefully make terms with the Austrian. With the intention of choosing a terrain where he could solemnly and honorably protest against Italy's adverse destinies, he left Monza for Como. From there, taking the mountain road, he headed towards Arona, where, having seized from the Austrian the 2 steamships, Luino was at that time occupied by a number of Austrian troops 4 times stronger than its own. Carlo and Verbano, he embarked his troops on them, and, sailing through Lake Lario, he reached Luino unexpectedly, thanks to the rapid marches with which he had accelerated his journey to reach Arona. Despite resolving to attack him in his own accommodations, and the incredible audacity resulting in a successful outcome, reaffirmed the well-known saying, "He who has no fear has a great element of victory." The name of Garibaldi, and the fierce determination with which he felt attacked, persuaded the enemy to retreat from the occupied city. But the intended division could not be put into effect so quickly that Garibaldi did not penetrate and manage to capture a detachment who had taken refuge in the inn of La Bicaccia. The more the enemy perceived this retreat as shameful, the more persistent they were in avoiding such an insult. The resistance was therefore stubborn and bloody, but it finally ceased to the impulse of ours, who, guided by Garibaldi himself, followed their leader with even greater fervor, inspired by his example and fiery words against the Austrian. Nor did this first foreign experiment quell Garibaldi's spirit, who, after allowing his companions some hours of rest during the night, at sunrise led them once again to pursue the enemy, who had concentrated his many forces in that area and formed a ring in which our men were trapped. They remained in that difficult position for 4 entire days without any serious attack. In the meantime, Garibaldi, having had time to well know the terrain and study a way to escape with his troops, at night would set out and, with careful marches, manage to evade the enemy and enter Morazzo, from where he planned to launch himself upon Varese in the hope of surprising General d'Aspra, who was quartered there with 10,000 men, while Garibaldi commanded barely 1,500. Given the immense number of enemies occupying those lands, he was unable to conceal his movements and intentions sufficiently, except for his arrival there, and the conceived plan known to the Austrian general at the same time. Having detached a corps of 500 men, equipped with artillery, he sent them, and if we are not mistaken, he conducted them himself to Morazon. Informed in time of the enemy's movements, Garibaldi prepared to resist the assault worthily, ordering that barricades be formed at every point in the city. And suddenly, work began from every side, in such a way that in a short time the state was such that it could receive the enemy, who did not delay in launching the attack. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the fire started. The Austrian with bombs, machine guns, and incendiary rockets attempted to drive out our troops, who, increasingly irritated by the growing damage to the city, held their ground. It was not over with the falling of night. He divided them into groups, dismissed them, and sent them towards the Swiss borders. The Austrian had heard that same arm that had struck him in Luino and Morazon again during those 2 encounters, and the rough minds of his terrified soldiers, fantasizing about demons coming to harm them, said that Garibaldi was bound with devils and wearing their uniform, recalling the red tunics of the Italian legionnaires who had come from Montevideo. Garibaldi, arriving that night at all locations where the risk was greatest, watched over everything, and with his presence fueled the battle fury among his comrades. But seeing that continuing this unequal struggle was useless, and fearing being caught between the 2 fires upon the appearance of dawn, given the enemy's overwhelming strength in those lands, around 3 hours after midnight, he left a good number of men behind to defend the retreat and mislead the enemy with gunfire, and then led his troops out of the city. Some have believed they could justly blame not only this act, but also hold the relentless warrior guilty, who in every way strained himself to dignify with arms the honor of Italy in face of the Austrians, a crime. Later, General D'Asper undoubtedly remembered these events when, in Parma, in the presence of an authority from our kingdom, he exclaimed, "The man who could have greatly aided your war, you did not know, and this is Garibaldi." Alors, when Garibaldi, after long and swift marches, reached Arona, he arrived with his exhausted troops, depleted by fatigue and every kind of privation, and no other means was left to him but to appeal to the municipal council of the city, which, from the substantial funds it held, disbursed just 7,000 lire, for which Garibaldi provided a receipt. Switzerland finally welcomed the honourable remnants of that column, which, after the Italian ruin known worldwide by the ill-fated name Salasco, had still stood against the invading enemy, gloriously hoisting high the flag that God gave to Italy, and its people will one day lift it victorious in the face of the stranger. As soon as Garibaldi had left Italy, fever developed in him, from which he had contracted the germs in Rovabella, and plagued by such discomfort, he went to France, and then returned to Nice to see his family, who shortly afterwards left for Genoa. However, anyone with senses and a heart of a true Italian citizen is far from reproaching, but rather will highly praise the man who, turning his thoughts to the entire nation, managed to rise above the marks and senseless issues of regional legalities, setting an example with this and other actions, and frankly showing the way to those who one day want to become unifiers of their fragmented homeland. His journey along the coastal area of the Riviera was a continuous triumph. Populations rushed from distant points in masses to greet him as he passed, and circles sent their delegations to congratulate the hero of Montevideo, the fighter of Luino. Despite the immense misfortune, enthusiasm among the peoples endured. In Genoa, he retired to a villa, intent on recovering from the fever that had reduced him to a deplorable state. And when the man who had so nobly known how to interpret their votes and desires appeared, they applauded, intending thereby to pay homage to the magnificent courage with which he had responded to the pulse of the most sacred of their hearts. It was in those circumstances that the king's government offered him a distinguished position in the national army, which Garibaldi could not accept, as he had already joined the Sicilians, who invited him to go to the island to take command of those troops. Accompanied by his loyal companions, who never left his side, he boarded a steamboat for Livorno to continue his journey to the island. He left Tuscany for the Roman provinces, heading towards Bologna, but upon reaching Filigare on the Tuscan border, he was forced to stop as a detachment of Swiss had been sent by General Zucchi to block his passage. He therefore decided to go to Bologna in person to convince the general to change his mind, which he refused to do under any circumstances. The population of this city celebrated the general's arrival with enthusiasm, and it strengthened his heart so much that it led him to renounce his commitment to Sicily and stay in Tuscany, which he left not long after. Realizing the oblique conduct of certain individuals in that government, who were not friends to anyone but to a province, not to people, but to all of Italy dedicated their lives and affections. Soon after, however, he managed to pass through Ravenna and head to Venice, only due to the threatening attitude of the people, who were outraged by this impolite conduct, and forced Zucchi to change his plans. Starting from Ravenna, Garibaldi had moved his men towards Cesena, and then to Ancona, and they had already reached the Catholic region when, following orders from their leader, they turned towards Rome. Garibaldi, anxious to contribute with his work during these critical moments to support the new order of things, from which he hoped for strong backing for the Italian cause, went to Rome, where he was immediately received by the provisional government to serve the state. In Ravenna, Garibaldi found Swiss troops increased in number and in a position that made them suspect hostile intentions, which led him to keep his approximately 250 men on guard and prepared for any event, except that the populations of Ravenna, Faenza, and elsewhere would rise against those mercenary foreigners at a single signal. Meanwhile, amidst these uncertainties, the death of Minister Rossi occurred in Rome, Pers X fled the state, and the provisional government was established in the Eternal City to protect the laws and interests of the people, abandoned at a time of danger by those who had presumed God had entrusted them with that sacred duty. In an attempt to safeguard the state from Naples, Garibaldi established his general headquarters in Rieti, pushing his forward sentinels up to the border between the two regions. From there, Garibaldi was about to reach them in Foligno to guide them towards the borders near Naples, which he only reached a month later, after having to pass through the population of Macerata, who provided him with refuge in their city, something for which they received government approval. We will not describe here the celebrations by which the populations of the new republic, through which Garibaldi passed with his column, hastened to honor him. It is enough to remember, as a testament to the enthusiasm stirred by his name, how people from every town came out to meet him several miles away, accompanied by music and military bands. With the powers granted to him by the government, he was nonetheless able to recruit the largest number of men possible, and in this he succeeded so well that within a short time he could count some 2,000 under his command, all of them the most ardent youth, from the humblest to the most privileged classes, united and brotherly in their holy love for Italy, full of faith in the man who had come with the certainty that they would be led to honorable deeds. Upon finally reaching Rieti, his first priority was to fortify the area with ditches and trenches and equip them with artillery. Then, devoting himself entirely to properly training his troops, he began by keeping them in constant exercise, ensuring that not a day passed without some new challenge keeping them alert. This included arms drills, formations, and strenuous runs. Among these latter, a notable patrol stands out, during which the entire column traversed the Apennine Mountains for several days, constantly plagued by rain. Despite having recently recovered from a significant illness, he did not spare himself, matching the stamina of his soldiers. He was so diligent and zealous in maintaining discipline that he would not rest one night, mounting his horse and riding to the border from Rieti to personally verify the accuracy and thoroughness of the duties being performed. They admired the populations in him, the extraordinary activity, the love with which he attended to the organization of the militias, and the modest dress that only distinguished itself with a white poncho lined in red, while the officers had been provided with appropriate clothing for their rank. The example of the chief and the conduct of the subordinates had ignited in the inhabitants of the surrounding towns such fervour and desire to be trained in arms that requests for instructors came from every side, which he readily granted, desiring nothing more than to see the Italians train in military efforts and become capable of fighting bravely. In this crisis, the Provisional Government convened a Constituent Assembly, where Garibaldi was elected by the Macerata College. Meanwhile, Pio VI, having taken refuge among the arms of the Bourbon in Gaeta, had rejected with anger and disdain the invitations from the Roman government to return to the capital. Obviously every means for the agreement had been exhausted. The provinces, wary from the state of uncertainty in which they found themselves and anxious about their future, demanded from the powers prompt and effective measures that would put an end to their painful fears and bring stability to the country's destiny, as well as restart political and social order. During the memorable session of February 5th, Garibaldi rose and proposed that the Republican government be proclaimed, which had already become the desire of everyone due to the hostile conduct of the corrupted Pope. This proposal was passed on to September 9th, when the legally constituted Assembly met for the first time after a vigorous debate. It was approved almost unanimously, with the enthusiastic applause of the large gathering. Protesting devotion to the Church, France, Spain, Austria, and Ferdinand Bourbon moved. The Vicar of Christ invoked and blessed foreign bombs that were supposed to reconquer the abandoned throne for him, and 4 armies turned against Rome. The resolution passed by the Roman Constituent Assembly, irritating passions opposed to popular liberties, had raised indignation against the nascent republic from a people who, while ostentatiously claiming religious charity, have neither beliefs nor faith, and only under the shadow of that cloak aspire to the triumph of absolute empire, from which they gain power, wealth, and honours at the expense of the people who suffer all the miseries of this world and pay heavily for their happy masters. France, faithful to its patriotic traditions, came first Judah and Cain against Italy, so that the 19th century witnessed renewed the fierce spectacle of a Brennus even more violent than the ancient one. Miserable were the conditions of the Roman Republic, and such as to strike terror into anyone lacking a superhuman dose of courage. Turned upside down were the fortunes of the war against Austria due to the impending defeat at Novara. Tuscany falling into Austrian hands, Lombardy dominated, Naples in full reaction for the Bourbon victory in Sicily, Civitavecchia occupied by Gallic hordes, and the territory of the Republic surrounded by strong and numerous enemies, already invaded in several parts. The timid, those ready to sacrifice every sense of national dignity and honour at the convenience and freedoms acquired without hardship or merit, advised negotiation with French soldiers to restore absolute priestly rule. But such a cowardly and shameful counsel was not adopted, alive God. The people of Rome, despite the calumnies by which they had tried to slander and turn them against Garibaldi and his men, came out in great numbers and merrily to welcome the newcomers. Minister of Azana hurried to embrace Garibaldi and speak words of praise and enthusiasm to the legion. He proclaimed the Republic, by force let force be opposed. At the same time he gathered his troops in the capital and recalled Garibaldi from Naples, who, finding himself in an agony, about 60 miles from Rome, started for the capital with his weary men, after forced marches across a terrain where they had even suffered water shortages. At 9 o'clock that morning the French appeared in force, numbering 7,000 men, in the arrogance of their insufferable pride, convinced that the Italians would not fight and would scatter at the sight of their weapons. They then turned towards the Portus, Pancrazio, where Garibaldi was with 300 men, guarding the defence. With Garibaldi's presence, the Romans felt their spirits rise, and each saw him as a pledge of certain victory. Meanwhile, all negotiations with French leaders having failed, Rome prepared to withstand the attack, which took place on April 30, 1849. Perhaps the example of Novara, whose disastrous outcome they wrongly attributed to a lack of courage on our part, had exaggerated in them that contempt for other peoples so deeply rooted in that vain nation. The enemy first attacked Porta Cavalleggeri, but were bravely repelled by the National Guard. Then Garibaldi retired in order with the survivors and joined the reserve. The memorable conflict lasted until 6 p.m., leaving around 500 French dead and nearly 600 prisoners. Garibaldi led that defence, earning new fame for his remarkable courage and the timely dispositions so energetically supported by the troops, the National Guard, and the people. He quickly reorganized the scattered files there, and joined other troops that had not yet entered battle, pouring impetuously onto the enemies who had already advanced near the gates. The impact and fury of the combatants were such that the French, having finally lost all order, began to retreat and seek refuge in nearby houses, where they managed to fortify themselves, but only for a short time, for Garibaldi, with just 3 companies, himself attacked them, fiercely engaging them until, after a long battle, he forced them to withdraw, making many prisoners. After some hours of rest, Garibaldi, burning with the desire to expel from Italy these new strangers who had come to trample it, directed his troops once again against the French, who had retreated to Palot, 10 miles from Rome, with a determined spirit to attack them and achieve a decisive result. With this handful of brave men, he withstood the impact of the enemy battalions, and for a moment held back their ferocity. He saw the Major Montaldi, in his prime and having come from America, fall dead at his side in that gigantic struggle. He saw Father Bassi, who was standing next to him, killed by a single blow as his horse was struck by a cannonball. A cannon shot had covered him with dust. His sword belt was touched by a musket shot. 2 others had pierced his poncho. Most of the 300 had fallen wounded in the chest, and their arms were weary from striking the enemy, and these, always superior in number, advanced, occupying the positions of the fallen, which were no longer defended. The enemy general, understanding Garibaldi's intentions, sent him a messenger proposing an armistice, to which he responded disdainfully, "Go propose it in Paris." But the same proposal, conveyed by him to the triumvirate, whose decisions he was bound to follow, was accepted by the supreme regulators, and Garibaldi returned, though reluctantly, to his accommodations in the city, which welcomed him with universal acclamations and cheers. On the day of battle, the soldiers had seen their leader approach the wounded affectionately, embrace them, and offer them comfort with words of kindness and praise. "Consolate yourselves," he said. "You fall for Rome's freedom and Italy's honor." Sublime words that reveal the depth of spirit, the power of sacrifice, and the strength of love for one's country in those who spoke them, and in those who heard them comforted. May all Italians understand and show themselves worthy of such consolations. The following day, as he led his troops to repel the French from Palo, he wanted to be the first to go to the battlefield where the valiant comrades had fallen, to give proper burial to the deceased, and to make sure if any wounded had been left behind. Observing these loving cares, the valorous soldiers felt their affection for their human and no less heroic leader grow ever stronger. Pure the malice of the men of Gaeta had placed him in such a situation that it imposed on him, without escape, this most painful sacrifice, and he accepted it. Therefore, the troops, not yet fully rested from their long labours on that day, April 30th, had to get back into action and prepare to shed fraternal blood. This enterprise deeply distressed Garibaldi's Italian soul. Abhorrent as he was to dissension and war among us, children of the same mother, he left Rome with 4,000 men, and ran to meet his brothers who had become enemies, eager to drink the bitter cup as soon as possible. After this victory gained against the stranger, for which Garibaldi rejoiced, having at last given the French a taste of if the Italians really do fight, that fatal fate which has weighed on unhappy Italy for so many centuries, wanted those very arms which had repulsed the invader from France to be turned a few days later against Italian chests, because in those days the territory of the Republic was invaded by an army sent by King Bourbon. It was necessary to resort to force in order to repel the aggressors, but Garibaldi determined to rouse them from their inertia and force them out of their quarters, kept 4 companies constantly aside throughout the night, with orders to harass him without cease, and maintain the alarm within his camp. The Bourbon forces numbered 7 Saarlandsen and had occupied Valmontone, while Garibaldi, by this late hour, had already moved to position himself in Palestrina, an advantageous location where he contemplated luring the enemy, who, intent on resting during the night, did not seem willing to engage in combat that day. Nor did he stop this fire when dawn broke, hoping that, worn out by being bothered, the enemy would finally be convinced to make a serious effort to repel the attackers. Nor was this a bad strategy, as he was missiled by their retreat and easily drew them into attacking their main force in Palestrina. It was 3 p.m. on May 8th when the fighting began, and it continued until late evening. The sign of despotism was brought low, republican virtue prevailed, but the unfortunate valor of the Neapolitan brothers left a painful testimony, 800 men out of combat. On one side, the Bourbonic forces were pushed back. On the other, the Austrians advanced towards Bologna. The Spanish troops also landed in Fiumicino, addressing a proclamation in their language to the people, announcing themselves as liberators. The French, who for many days had remained quiet in their quarters, with the aim of gaining time to obtain reinforcements of arms, men, and siege artillery, plotting in their chests the perfidious design of fully restoring the former order of things, condemned by public conscience, having made some movements that seemed to threaten Rome once again, Garibaldi was immediately recalled to the city. In those moments, the Triumvir Mazzini, addressing the French plenipotentiary, pointed out the disloyalty and shame of continuing with hostile designs against Rome in the face of the triple invasion mentioned. There would be something akin to the despicable agreement of 1772 against Poland, exclaimed the undaunted Triumvir, and the agreement among all the invaders was too evident, as evidenced by the debates in the French Assembly during the October sessions. Bologna had been waging a fierce battle against the Austrian army for several days at that time, even though it was devoid of artillery and lacked much of its young defenders who had rushed to Rome's defense. Its ancient pride gave it enough strength to resist bombardment and attacks from the overwhelming force for 8 entire days, inflicting heavy costs on the victors. The barbarian horde was accompanied by priest Bedini in the name of Pius X. However, as negotiations to suspend hostilities began between Lesseps and the Triumvirate, the government decided to take advantage of that time by dispelling the Bourbon army, which had once again encamped with 16,000 men, equipped with numerous artillery pieces in Velletri and Palestrina, led by King Ferdinand, who poorly handled the humiliation of his first defeat at the hands of the Republican forces. Despite these reversals and the dangers surrounding them, the Republic remained steadfast and did not weaken in spirit, sending 12,000 men with 12 artillery pieces to meet the Bourbon. Colonel Giuseppe Marocchetti commanded the vanguard, while Garibaldi led the battle group, with overall command entrusted to General-in-Chief. It was on the update of 19 when Garibaldi, having advanced towards Velletri, encountered the enemy in great numbers at a distance of several miles, which he did not hesitate to attack with 100 cavalrymen. Following his style of showing extreme courage and determination in certain cases to surprise fortune. He suffered the worst in that skirmish, and during the retreat his horse fell to the ground, which he also dragged down, leaving him with a contused face and a wounded hand. He charged the enemy with his bayonet at several points, and perhaps with the few troops under his command he would have been able to deliver a decisive blow that would have made him master of part of the city, if powerful Bourbon artillery placed on the height of the Capuchins had not kept him at bay with continuous and intense fire. But quickly climbing back onto his horse, and taking the lead of 500 infantrymen, he returned to the charge with bayonets lowered, before which the enemy gave way and eventually retreated behind the walls of Velletri, from where they continued to offer fierce resistance, despite which Garibaldi continued to fight, though inferior in numbers, as the main force of the Roman expedition had not yet arrived at the battle scene. Garibaldi had in mind the project of cutting off King Ferdinand's escape route and making him a prisoner, which, perhaps fearing, he had managed to save himself just as the battle was about to begin, giving orders to his soldiers to follow him during the night. All day on the 19th, both sides fought fiercely, and only in the evening did the fratricidal slaughter cease, which had intensified with the arrival during the day of other Republican forces under the walls of Velletri, silently abandoned by the Bourbon troops who had come to join the fleeing king. The Romans, already prepared to attack, occupied it the following day, May 20th. That clash was painful and memorable for the number of brothers in the enemy camp left out of combat, which reached 200. Having participated in that expedition against Velletri, Garibaldi, after returning to Rome, turned 2 days later with 8,000 men towards the kingdom of Naples, not without hope of catching up with those fugitives by accelerating his marches, nor without the belief that entering the kingdom might spark some favorable movement for the cause of freedom. As soon as Garibaldi reached Roccodarcy, receiving orders from the government to force the march towards the capital, the French preparing to attack it once again. He therefore continued his journey, resting neither day nor night, in such a way that on June 2 he entered Rome with his column. And this flattery appears evident from the proclamation that was issued during those days addressed to the Neapolitans. "Brothers," he said, "we do not come to impose any law on you. We come to tell you a free word, a motive for noble affections, to raise the banner of our common homeland among you." And if the French were not, perhaps Europe saw from that song of Italy a powerful spark, that the fire would have been awakened with greater fervour. An hour after midnight, the French advanced towards Villa Pamphili, responding in Italian to better conceal themselves from the alarm call of the sentries, "Long live Roman Republic." Thus, they managed to overwhelm the garrison guarding that point with 6,000 men. The French general had set the 4th as the day to resume hostilities, as proven by the letter he sent to General Roselli. However, instead of waiting for that date, fire began at nightfall on the Sind, with the intention of surprising the defenders and completing the operation, which was considered difficult, despite claims that the Italians do not fight. But when news of this betrayal reached the other units, all arrived indignant at their designated positions, ready for any eventuality. As the enemy continued to advance and use artillery, the battle quickly became general. From the first rumours, Garibaldi had rushed to the quarter of his troops, who were already ready to follow his orders. He said a few words, emphasizing strict discipline and reminding them of Italian honour, and led them at a charge pace towards Porta Sancresio. The enemy had already occupied Villa Pamphili and that of Valentini, as well as the other one of the Quattro Venti. The energetic resistance put up by the troops that had arrived was overcome by sheer numbers, making their efforts to eject them futile. Garibaldi arrived at this point and, without taking a position at the head of the battalions any more, chased them with his example. He led them with his usual fervour to assault the enemy with bayonets. There an intense struggle ensued, lasting for 4 entire hours without stopping. In the end, the French, unable to hold on any longer, retreated from the already occupied field, but remained in Villa Pamphili. Reinforced with new troops, the enemy resumed the assault, and after several hours of desperate fighting, they retook the abandoned positions. Around noon, Garibaldi reorganized his men, who were still the same, and led them for a second time against the French, who had twice as many forces, and fiercely contested the ground, eventually having to retreat. Wherever Garibaldi appeared, he sowed terror and death, but with fresh troops and numerous battalions at their disposal. The enemy continuously pushed forward new columns, which could not withstand the number. After repeatedly facing the enemy, and always with the same courage, Garibaldi ordered a retreat and withdrew to the place known as the Ship, from where he continued fighting until evening. The French suffered 4 times more losses than ours, and admitted that it was a battle of giants. Our valiant friend Giacomo Medici, colonel of the legion bearing his name, gave a solemn proof on that day of what Italy can expect from him in the future national war. The battle lasted for 17 hours. The struggle was more bloody and ferocious than anywhere else. At Villa Pamphili, where Garibaldi almost always fought hand to hand with cold steel, he reported to the triumvirate on what had been accomplished that day. Speaking of his comradess, he cannot distinguish anyone, because they all distinguished themselves equally. Garibaldi lost 2 of his officers who had come with him from America that day, the senior Rorino and Peralta, worthy of honorable memory. It is impossible, and it would be too long in any case, to follow one by one the numerous actions in which Garibaldi made himself remarkable for valor and caution, both in repelling the enemy and in guiding his troops to attack them in their own trenches. On June 5th and 6th, the assailants renewed their attacks, but were always repelled, making these days memorable for their immense losses and new victories of the Italian arms. Garibaldi dealt them such fierce blows that they often left them terrified and bloodied. The struggles of Homer's times were renewed on those days, with great praise from our side, to the detriment and damage of the enemies. Since the daylight was not enough for the heated minds, Garibaldi would go out at night to attack the French, who certainly did not expect such audacity. Attacking the famous chasseurs de Vincennes, they could not long resist that impulse, and sought refuge by fleeing through the windows. His ardour, activity, and indomitable courage in these daring factions were such that the Romans called him the Lion of the Serra. Among all others, memorable for his individual courage is the incident where he drove out a group of 8 cavalrymen from a palace outside Portus. Having French batteries planted, whose fires proved excessively harmful to the Romans, Garibaldi took a subterranean route that would lead them to that roof with the intention of making the mines explode in the air, preventing the enemy from turning the waters within the already advanced works which he had noticed. An unexpected delay caused the vanguard to fire some shots before reaching the location, alerting the French of the impending danger and making the prepared assault impossible. On the evening of October 10, meditating a daring blow, Garibaldi gathered a strong body of troops in St. Peter's Square and arranged them for an ambush, leading them outside the walls with orders to advance silently and attack the enemy camp on the agreed signal with their bayonets. He then relocated his headquarters to the Spada Villa, which was also exposed to enemy fire. This anger the French had harboured against Garibaldi, who, when they learned that he used to observe their operations from the top of the Corsini Palace, and direct the movements of the Roman troops, began to rain down a barrage of cannonballs and bombs on the unfortunate house, causing significant damage that forced Garibaldi to abandon it shortly after, as it was in danger of collapsing. On that day the French displayed such proofs of audacity, valour, and military science that they astonished and terrified their spectators. To this the triumvirate, steadfast in their honourable intent, replied, "We never break our promises. We have promised to defend the honour of the country and the flag of the Republic. We will keep our promise." And after 12 hours the battle resumed with renewed fury. In the meantime, on the 12th day, General Oudinot, having completed the approach works, was in a position to bombard Rome. So he addressed himself to the authorities, writing that if the city did not surrender within 12 hours of the summons, he would attack it with all his force. He seemed never to feel the need for rest or food. It would have been said that in the fire and harsh labours of war his body found refreshment and new strength. The occasion for new immense efforts and desperate valour was given to Garibaldi on the night when the enemies, by the slow but sure path of siege works, appeared within the walls of the city. He found himself at that moment in a reserve position, and as soon as he received the ill-fated news that troops from a hill were approaching to assault with bayonets lowered against the enemy, who had already taken strong positions in their prepared defences, his brilliant virtue availed him nothing. Garibaldi reported on that terrible day, when he personally directed the action, a wise report to the government. There it is said, "The fury of our men was at its peak, as they, lacking ammunition, picked up stones, and with them defeated the enemy, took their bayonets from their rifles, and used them as if they were a terrible weapon." Throughout all those days of struggle from the 13th to the 27th, Garibaldi was seen day and night continuously in the areas where the battle raged most intensely. And the danger became more evident. People did not know how he could appear so constantly everywhere that the emergencies of those fortunate moments required the presence of a man who was worth as much for his counsel and audacity. Yet he did not lose heart, for at dawn, with renewed fury and determination, he once again threw himself into the daring struggle. He urged the soldiers forward until they actually stepped onto the enemy's works, and with such vehemence and scorn for danger that he advanced so far that our men touched the tips of their carbines to those of the enemy, whose guns protruded from their parallel defences. Pure this second attempt remained fruitless in the face of the obstacle presented by the entrenchments, without which the enemy would have had to retreat, as they had done on other occasions, in a bloody and defeated state. Those were supreme moments, and the position was most unfortunate. Yet despite the courage and desire to match the enemy that redoubled in all upon witnessing the sublime spectacle of Garibaldi and his men, Rome lived again as it did in ancient times. From their new position, the French bombarded the city relentlessly for many days, in severe damage to the ancient monuments that other barbarians and more barbaric times had respected. Little did they realize that day and night thundered down on the city with mortars and cannons, even pushing the overwhelming battalions to attack. They demanded, in the name of humanity and civilized nations, that he cease further bombing to save from destruction the monumental city, considered under the moral protection of all civilized countries in the world. Despite all the outcry from the Christian world raised by its representatives in Rome against the vandalism of the French soldiers, the bombs continued to fall relentlessly on the heroic capital of Italy. And the ferocity of these strangers, who had not been offended or provoked, descended upon Italy for no other reason than Numbers 12, without any right but that of blood, to such an extent that the consuls of foreign nations, indignant at such atrocities, directed a note to the French general protesting against that manner of attacking which not only threatened the property and lives of neutral inhabitants, but also those of women and children. The more these self-proclaimed liberators of peoples were a small number of almost all new recruits to the arms and lacking powerful means of war they could have used, the more their triumph was thwarted, and they were often beaten. Consequently, their rage festered into cruelest acts. There burst forth a fight so fierce from both sides that for the whole night they continued fighting, the deadly encounter protracting itself until late in the following day. But through the darkness, aiming to sneak in unseen and by surprise, since the approach of day, and facing off against our troops' face. To face had always brought them only harm and shame. This result was perhaps due to the attempted blow on the night of 25, when from all the points attacked they were courageously repulsed. Garibaldi was always in the midst of the fire, inciting his companions to that fury and urging them not to yield, to hold firm for the honour of Italy, and wherever he went he heightened the spirit and anger of the fighters. They repeated the assault on the night of 27, taking advantage of a dense fog and attacking with bayonets. But neither the surprise nor the determination of the assault availed them, as an insurmountable wall of citizen breasts opposed itself to their progress. "You are fighting for freedom and for the honour of Italy," was his favourite war cry, and at that cry the blows doubled in number, under which the French fell, biting that harsh touch of earth. The horrible rain of bombs and grenades incessantly accompanied the attacks on the fortifications, even though they were still protected by the artillery that had already greatly widened the breach, on which, after finally launching a vast number of men by the 30th, the enemies could place a battery rendering every further resistance virtually futile, despite poorly understanding Garibaldi's conduct of that triumph for the enemy, who was now no longer within human power to resist for long. He wanted to prove himself capable of chasing them from their occupied positions, and succeeded. If the noble purpose was not carried out, it must be attributed to causes that did not depend on him, and which history, as a faithful guardian of human actions, will make known later. These storms, far from deterring Garibaldi from any further resistance, confirmed him more and more in the thought of continuing to oppose the French in the third line, protected by barricades on the other side of the Tiber, after having destroyed the bridges of San Angelo and Sisto. However, the French soon returned to battle, and where Garibaldi had to retreat, he did not give up trying his luck, which smiled on him for the last time, as after once again repelling the enemy, when everything seemed lost, they were reinforced with new troops, making any other attempt impossible for human strength. Not willing to surrender the glorious arms to the foreign invader, Garibaldi resolved to leave Rome and venture into new dangers, and appealing to his companions with these words that we faithfully report soldiers. This is what I offer to those who want to follow May hunger: cold sun. Not pay, no barracks, no ammunition, but continuous signals, forced marches, and sections at the bayonet. Whoever loves their country and glory, follow me. Garibaldi. Garibaldi was aware of the fervour with which both would equally follow in his footsteps, and so, in order to better conceal their and his own situation and his intentions, he divided his men into many small detachments, sending them in different directions, thus appearing at the same time in most dissimilar places. As for the enemies, the French and Austrians, although in much greater numbers, not knowing where to turn to catch him, were forced to stray at random, wasting their soldiers with fruitless marches, who sometimes, when least expected, found themselves suddenly attacked by shots from an enemy they could no longer trace. He gathered about 3,000 men and set off towards Tivoli, not far from believing that by remaining for some time in the countryside he might gather together greater and more considerable elements to organize a long resistance against the foreigners, who had invaded Italy from 2 different sides, and who at the same time were actively pursuing him, clearly showing that these others, descended from France and spouting words of liberty, were not much different from the Austrians, called barbarians. With this continuous succession of marches and chases, I had conducted myself in Tuscany, intending also to try those populations and learn the state of their minds. It therefore appeared near Montepulciano on the 10th of July, and halted there to rest on the Alpine mountain Folonico, where it was impossible for the enemy to come close. He entered the city later, where he took some gun-shots from a convent of friars. This led Garibaldi to keep them with him and escort them out, along with the sub-prefect and some priests from that town, whom he released soon after without further concern for them or the friars. Heading from Montepulciano towards Arezzo, they were in the latter city and in Florence itself, causing alarm among those involved in the restoration. The Italian city of Arezzo closed its doors at Garibaldi's approach, as if a foreign enemy or criminal threatened it. To this conduct, the people and inhabitants of the surrounding areas protested solemnly, quickly gathering to greet the brothers and provide them with necessary supplies, so they could alleviate their hunger and thirst from those long struggles. In those moments, the conditions in Italy and Europe were not favorable at all for the cause of freedom, so the peoples, unable to respond to Garibaldi's calls, remained quiet, oppressed by foreign armies stationed in our provinces. Having realized the painful reality, Garibaldi, who had to postpone of his noble purpose to a later date, retraced his steps and headed towards Umbria. Even during that retreat, he was always followed by the Austrian army, which pursued him in great numbers without ever relaxing. For such circumstances, that retreat towards the Roman states was remarkable, where Garibaldi finally resolved to take refuge in San Marino, assured of a warm welcome. The most rigorous discipline was observed by Garibaldi with his troops throughout this excursion. Such scruple drove him to impose the severest punishments for even minor infractions. The places through which he passed had nothing but praise for the order and respect shown to people and property. Hasty marches and countermarches, brief rests, and constant turmoil from the thought of an imminent attack, vigilance of the most diligent sort, races through alpine places deemed inaccessible, sometimes surrounded by the enemy, who was on the verge of sealing them off in a vast circle that grew tighter and tighter, and with turns and twists managed to escape from their grasp, which had already stretched over them. At other times daringly launching himself among the enemy ranks, and transiting to the desired point without offending them. Whenever provisions were lacking, they turned to the communities that supplied them with what they needed, and it was never permitted to take from others, even what was strictly necessary. On many occasions, his officials urged him to attack the enemy, but after considering their difficult position and evaluating the situation with greater caution, he consistently refused to be the aggressor. So he entered San Marino, where the government and people gave him every honorable and happy reception due to brothers. Without means of transport for the wounded or a safe place to accommodate them, how could he have agreed in such dire straits that his companions exposed themselves to the risks of combat, from which he was convinced he could no longer derive the benefits he had initially hoped for? Here is the translation of the provided text from Otto to English. Called to themselves by the officials, he made it known to them that it was now futile to continue the endeavour and necessary for them to disband, each taking care of their own safety in that friendly land. In the meantime, the Austrian, through the government of San Marino, proposed a capitulation to Garibaldi, offering free passage for his column to retreat to their respective countries, and ensuring him a passage to America. After consulting with the regent of San Marino on how to save their companions, he refused any agreement with the Austrian, refusing to humiliate himself. Thanks to the escort of generous patriots from those areas, the small brigade was able to pass unnoticed among the enemies and reach the shore without any obstacle. With no other field left in Italy where they could fight against the foreigner, except Venice, he conceived the daring plan to go and make the final tests in the heroic city, which now stood alone supporting the Italian flag with war. Therefore, accompanied by his wife, who had wanted to follow him from Rome at any cost, and 100 men who, in spite of everything, could not resolve to abandon him, he descended from the mountain of San Marino to the plains of Cesenatico, where numerous Austrians were on vigilant guard, more than ever eager to have him in their hands. Only fortune was not on the side of that holy martyr, who, lost in the race, fell into the power of the enemy and later died in Bologna, broken by German lead bullets, instruments of clerical anger. This loss left an immense pain in Garibaldi's heart, who in the Netherlands revered the true type of a man of God. This was the 3rd time he had been struck in the most sensitive part of his heart since he had seen his country again. Since the first days of his landing in Genoa, Death put an end to a long illness, snatching away from him his ancient comrade, in arms, Lanzani, whom I held in high esteem and warm affection. Fighting against the French under the walls of Rome, I had lost another dear friend to him, both for his valour and military sense, Colonel Messina from Bologna. It seemed as if a malevolent fate, saving his life from so many and proud dangers, wanted to make it wretched and unbearable for him, piling one sorrow on top of the other that here had not yet found an end. The Austrian, informed about Garibaldi's refusal of the conditions proposed to him, issued severe orders against anyone who gave shelter to him and his companions, and as if this act itself was already barbaric, another added even more barbarity. It was known that the indivisible companion stood by his side, and he, the German, reminded the people so that the husband might be more readily recognized, and he did not shame to point out additionally, as a clearer indication, that she was pregnant for several months. The condition of poor Anna, who would have been a cause for mercy against any other enemy, served instead with the Austrian to make her state even more desolate and tearful. Such are the men who weigh down our unfortunate homeland. But the murderous decree of the stranger did not instill terror in the hearts of those noble inhabitants, for they not only received the fugitives with fraternal welcome everywhere, but found waiting on the shore Bragozzi fishing boats that took them in and brought them far away. His ardour and extraordinary excitement communicated itself to his companions, inspiring them with the alluring depiction of new dangers and the most splendid glories. Thus, after travelling all night, they arrived at dawn to the height of Comacchio, when before them, not very far away, rose the Austrian warships watching over those waters, and without a doubt expecting them. Reviving the sea and feeling it surge around him, as if it were the dear voice of a friend, Garibaldi rejoiced among the jesting winds that would come to dishevel their long hair on their foreheads, and sailing towards Venice, he always felt his spirit strengthen at the thought that in a short while he would be able to touch the desired land, and perhaps do one more good deed that would not only illuminate his name, but, most importantly, bring honour to the Italian name and benefit the cause of freedom. Just discovered, the Furongli turned to face the cannons, which began firing fiercely at them. Soon, some Bragozzi capsized, their occupants perishing miserably, while others were hit and made prisoners. Only, as far as we know, Garibaldi managed to regain the coast with his Palestromo. Finally he reached the shore, but there his fortitude and valour were to face their most severe test, a trial that no father or husband could bear. Perhaps it was due to his rare maritime skill, the strength of his arm, and his singular calm blood, which he always maintains even in extreme danger, or perhaps thanks to providences that reserved him for a great achievement, that he was able to evade his pursuers in this emergency. Upon reaching the shore, barely a faint breath of life remained to the wretched one. It was a deserted place, and no help could be provided. Auntie ran exhausted up the mountains for many days and nights without rest, with constant dismay in her heart over her husband's fate, and privations of all that was indispensable to her. And the fateful encounter at Seal contributed to exhaust the robust forces of the unhappy woman, and drive her to the brink of death. Later, someone arrived whom Garibaldi had quickly sent to Ravenna for a doctor. Additionally, through the kindness of those people, she obtained a donkey cart, on which she placed the dying woman, and took her to the home of a farmer in a land belonging to Marchese Guiccioli, not far from the sea. The poor family that lived there, moved by such misfortune befalling these strangers, offered a bed for the dying woman. Wretched, just as Garibaldi had time to lay her down, the suffering had already ceased. Poor Anna! She used to visit with so much love the grave of her little girl in America, whom God took from her and placed among his angels. With the same affection she had shown in adorning her life with beauty. She continually cared for ensuring that the tomb did not appear too sad, and it bore witness to a love that lasted beyond the grave, Poor Anna! That blow struck the soul of one who had so many times in his days felt himself move not a muscle while surrounding himself with desolation, and death he bowed his head, as if yielding to such great pain. Then he asked for a glass of water to alleviate the burning that clutched at his throat, and lifting his gaze to the sky, almost invoking it as a witness to the suffering he endured for humanity's cause, he gave one last painful goodbye to the cold, bare form of his beloved woman, and quickly left that house and disappeared. It was great mercy if the Christian charity of the good farmer who had hosted her could give rest to her bones in an unmarked field, without a sign indicating to her loved one's piety, or the reverence of those who hold such virtue, and love for a spouse in high regard. But those bones could not find peace. Upon leaving the infamous house, Garibaldi had with him a trusted captain from Sardinia, who had come from America with him to participate in the national war. For the destitute dog, roaming about, disturbed that earth which covered them, and revealed to the Austrian investigator the guilt of the poor farmer, who, convinced he had given shelter in life, and then burial to that deceased person, was imprisoned by those ferocities. I ignored wherever the fate touched the man who had love from all. There was no patriot in Italy who did not eagerly ask for news of him. Accompanied by this man, he thought to gain the Sardinian state, the only place in Italy where he could hope for tranquillity and security. But the path was difficult and long. All the Roman states on that side were occupied by Austrians. Even Tuscany was filled, yet trusting in God and his star, he undertook the perilous journey. The hope of knowing him out of danger soon dwelt in the hearts of all the good people. But sometimes the happy hopes were cut short by the long silence and the lack of any new news. The rumour spread that he had arrived in Venice, and this was a pitiful invention to evade Austrian surveillance. Even in Venice itself, his imminent arrival was announced. But amid the uncertainty of these rumours, everyone lost themselves in conjectures, making vows for the salvation of such a man. Meanwhile, having come across men for whom the patria is a sacred word, he had found in them support and brotherly asylum. For many days he remained hidden in a place that we do not yet believe to be free of danger for those generous souls to make known. Escorted by some trusted one from one point to another, he slowly approached, often idle during the day. He took refuge in the woods, waiting for the favour of night to continue his journey. Finally, after much wandering and many painful events, he saw the sea from the Tuscan coast. Sometimes, pressed by events, he circled among the enemy ranks, while they were perhaps contemplating how they might have reached him. At other times, while sitting in an inn awaiting refreshment, he found himself seated next to the Croat, who, without suspicion, saw the stranger rise and depart. Wherever he went, he found passionate and brave patriots who cared not for dangers or toil. And we know of a parish priest whose name we await in darker times to record to the gratitude of all Italy, who comforted the distinguished fugitive with all those loving cares that only a noble soul, educated in the sublime doctrine of the gospel, can suggest. Young Mario, pursued by cruel enemies, and with death roaring behind him, still gazed out at the waves in search of a sail to save him. And as Mario he saw a favourable boat approach the shore, and welcome him into its embrace, but among the fugitives from Rome. He found more generous hearts that, far from being frightened at his name, rowed more cheerfully towards the Sardinian coast, proud to be able to rescue such a man. It was September 5th, and on the 35th day of their troubled voyage, when the boat guided by fishermen hoisted its sail in the harbour of Portovina. Garibaldi had only 3 lire to his name, so he could hardly repay his saviours with money, and instead he offered them a single embrace, which those good countrymen embraced with tears in their eyes, and a written note that would bear witness to his gratitude for this great favour. Received in Portovina with signs of manifest reverence and love from the people, he obtained means from a friend to travel to Chiavari, where upon his arrival the government seized him through its agents, and had him escorted by the carabinieri to Genoa, considering him guarded in the ducal palace there. Never did he utter a complaint about that manner of dealing with him. It seemed as if he were unaware, or gave no importance, to the caprice of his enemy's fortune. The Chamber, declaring that the arrest of General Garibaldi and his threatened expulsion from Piedmont are detrimental to the rights preserved by the statute and the feelings of the Italian nation, proceeds to adopt the following resolution. Despite this, Garibaldi continued to be supported in prison, where many of the most distinguished men who were in Genoa, as well as the officers of the garrison, would gather each day to visit him. The Parliament, having learned of the minister's conduct against a citizen who had many rights not only to a loving reception for his misfortunes, but also to respect and every honourable demonstration for what he had done in the service of the common fatherland, strongly condemned, and by an overwhelming majority of votes, that scandalous behaviour, adopting the following resolution, which we report in praise of the noble sentiments and generous indignation manifested on September 20th by the national representatives. To those who approached him in those days, he spoke exclusively of Italy's future, encouraging them to have faith and unite harmoniously for the national war, neither distant nor lost, so that they might attain the longed-for victory. Even those who had prejudged him went to see him out of mere curiosity, and left with a sense of admiration, if not affection. Many others who currently hold the most prestigious titles in Italy's estimation among nations are, as he was and is in part, Garibaldi, slandered, and would force their enemies to recant and esteem them if they were well known. Wishing to see his mother and children again in Nice, Garibaldi obtained permission from the government to go there by steamboat, and it was said that a police agent would accompany him incognito. It is impossible to describe the enthusiasm of the people of Nice at seeing their fellow citizen after so many adventures and following the events in Rome. He stayed there only long enough to visit his relatives and friends, and then re-embarked on the steamboat for Genoa, as he had promised, and again placed himself at the disposal of the government. Shortly after setting sail for Tunis, he arrived in that port on September 21st, but even there French vengeance and the Sardinian government's pursuit awaited him, if the rumours are true that spread 13. On his journey from Genoa to Barbary, the steamer that conveyed him stopped in Cagliari, where the population, just informed of Garibaldi's fate, gathered in large numbers on small boats, driven by the desire to see at least once that man of whom they had heard so many noble and wonderful deeds. As a stop to keep him away from the state, a few days later we had him transported by a warship to Tunis, having Garibaldi chosen that African city as his residence, perhaps in defiance of this civil Europe that, with acts true barbarians, took away people's freedom, bombed innocent cities while boasting of being liberators, and went so far as to persecute even an individual, alone and helpless, who had escaped by miracle from so many and such grave dangers. The fiery islanders, whose veins pulse with ardent Latin blood, repeatedly echoed those shores with cheers for the strong Italian and wishes for a more fortunate future. Not far away, that was a final goodbye Italy sent to the brave warrior from its extreme edge, and that goodbye lingered over the waters of the Gulf, like the cry of a desolate mother who sees her beloved son torn from her breast. The Bey, yielding to the demands of the great nation that could not rest tranquil if that man found a place in Barbary, denied Garibaldi permission to land in his city, and at the same time, as if he wanted to manifest his non-hostile spirit to him, and perhaps as an excuse for the rejection imposed by the stronger one, the Bey offered him a ship so that he could go to Malta, where Garibaldi would have liked to transfer himself. That little island was for Garibaldi the oasis, called by the exhausted traveller, overwhelmed by long and perilous desert hardships, shaken by fierce winds. Ivy found rest, and friendly faces and hearts that alleviated his pains. All the inhabitants competed to show him their interest and esteem. From the richest to the poorest, no good islander refrained from shaking his hand, which had so fiercely struck Italy's enemies. They loved him so much, and he had inspired such confidence with his simple and cordial manner, similar to Mario, who, fleeing from the coasts of Italy, turned to that same port, not far from which ancient Carthage sat, and immediately had to leave again, taking to sea once more to escape his fellow citizens and barbarians' persecution. Garibaldi returned with the same ship, from whose captain he was disembarked on the small island of Maddalena, located near the north coast of Sardinia, and left there under the guard of the local military commander until the government made new decisions. We particularly wish to remember here, as a matter of honour, Mr. Suzzini, the mayor of the islet, father of that same Suzzini, chosen by Garibaldi as his successor in command of the Italian Legion in Montevideo, from whom our friend received the most distinguished proofs of affectionate friendship. During the many days when he almost forgot to leave there, he used to exercise his body and distract his mind with hunting and fishing, his favourite pastimes. At that sight Garibaldi was not a cold spectator. He leaped into the sea, followed by one of his companions, and with such effort, using his strong limbs and his wit, those sailors were saved. Thus Providence gave him an opportunity to show to his dear guests how to repay their debts of gratitude. And one day, as he was by the sea, he saw a small sailing boat navigating along the coast with obvious danger of capsizing. As the wind blew impetuously, nor did he mistake himself, for soon this grew stronger, and the sail became fuller, and the feeble boat, not bearing enough weight to maintain its balance, dipped and turned over in the waters. Not allowing the government for him to stay longer in the Sardinian territory, he had himself transported by the brigantine Colombo to Gibraltar, the only place where he could go among the nearest ones in Europe. Garibaldi, not wanting to leave Europe, thanked those noble sons of the free America, and preferred to try again for Africa. At his arrival there, he obtained the governor's permission only to disembark and stay for a few days. When he asked the Spanish consul if he could be accommodated in any part of Spain, he received a negative response. Going to France was not something he could consider. In the face of so much depravity, the ex-consul and his officers from his warships, almost protesting against such infamy to the honour of humanity, presented themselves to offer the brave man, persecuted by the worms of diplomacy, gold, asylum in their country, and a warship to transport him. A few days later he left for Tangier, in the Moroccan Empire, where he was welcomed by a friend and found that peaceful asylum which he had vainly desired in his homeland. All of Garibaldi's life is a continuous and fruitful sacrifice to freedom and the homeland. In his private acts, as well as in his public ones, at joyful gatherings with friends, as well as at serious and solemn assemblies, one thing always dominated his thoughts and discussions: patriotism and humanity. Upon learning these facts, posterity will undoubtedly marvel at such ingratitude towards a citizen of such illustrious standing, and ask indignantly if the frequent expressions of love for Italy and freedom in our time by certain individuals are not an irony cast in the face of a people of fools. The sublime aspirations of his strong soul constantly rose to that highest concept. He took little or no care for anything else, so he was always seen fighting and defending the American cause with the same fervour with which he wielded arms in Lombardy and Rome. He always kept the thought close at hand and tirelessly pursued action, believing that Italy needs to rehabilitate itself in the world's opinion through strong and magnanimous deeds, and that freedom, like bread, must be earned with the sweat of one's brow. He wishes to fight only in Italian battles, and rejects any foreign intervention as an insult to national honour and a stain that would forever remain in Italy's history. Italy can and must do it herself. His past commands him, and the grandeur of his mission demands it. The slave, restless and inconstant, vigorous struggle is for him the most sublime protest of a man conscious of his dignity. he who, with arrogance or feebly acting, invokes and accepts relief from altruistic charity, inspires scorn and contempt. A man of humanity, he dreams of brotherhood among nations in the future, but at the Feast of Nations he wants to sit as an equal or not at all. He would prolong the slavery of his homeland rather than have it freed by foreign hands. He would break his sword and seek death among the hostile chains if Italy were to suffer that shame. Italy can descend from its height like the god, man into the darkness of the tomb, but like the god, man, it must rise again, by its own virtue great, above all nations in the past. It must be so in the future. The example of others is harmful to whoever strays from the common sphere. The same energy and passion of his youth still govern that untamable spirit. His brief speech, usually calm, flames up, and a peculiar splendor sparkles in his eyes when he speaks of the fatherland and national glory. Austere in his habits, frugal in bestowing praise, from his lips never issues a word that offends. He does not dignify received insults with a complaint, and forgets them. Unyielding in his indignation towards cowards and the sad, he is indulgent with the valiant. Without pride or humility, he treats all with equal respect. The simple soldier has always free access to him. Educated from his earliest years in the principles of popular liberty, and convinced that Italy must, in the future, at some distant or near date, be won in order to reach the height of its destiny. Every thought and act of his concerning the fatherland was always directed towards these two goals, but equally conscious that above all Italians need to gain independence, he, like all his political brothers 14, is ready, setting aside any individual conviction, to adopt the flag of him who offers greater chances of success, and enters the field irrevocably determined to drive the Austrian beyond the Alps. Garibaldi is today 42 years old. When a painful thought troubles his mind, he usually lowers his cap on his forehead and stands or walks alone and silently. He has a light but slow pace, and moves with composed gravity without any trace of study. Equal to the lowest of his men in food, clothing, and the deprivations of military life, he distinguishes himself only by his dignified bearing, and the reverence that no one can deny him. Those who approached him remained his friends. His comrades in arms always had affection for him as a son. Usually serious and thoughtful, the sight of a friend cheers him up, and a smile appears on his lips. From people of his intimacy, sometimes jests escape him, but only for a moment, almost as if he were assailed by remorse for wasting time. Respectful toward his mother, an excellent husband, with children, he is now smiling, now severe. He left in nice his elderly mother, with his 3 children, Menotti, Ricciotti, and whose heiresy to education is provided for with paternal affection by the lawyer Garibaldi, cousin to the general, he, his friend Dederi, and no one else. The many trials endured for his own country and others have brought him poverty, persecution, an honoured name in Europe and America 15, the hatred of the sad, and the love of his homeland, of which he forms one of the most splendid glories. Generous men, of whom Italy, thank God, is not lacking, offered considerable sums to the brave man, which he did not accept. Of a hard-working nature, he finds sustenance wherever he goes with his work. For that purpose, he would not hesitate to embark as a simple sailor. Sobriquet, modest, and tolerant of hardships, little suffices for him. He accepted with joy a superbly crafted sword in Florence, a product of a national subscription. Another, executed by the distinguished artist Borani in Turin, also a gift from his compatriots, will soon be deposited in his maternal home. Of these swords, one represents Italy on the hilt, leaning on the blade, and waiting to restore its strength. May God give it vigor. When the time comes to lift it again, Garibaldi will not leave it idle. From the arid mountains of Morocco, where he contemplates Italy and plans a great vengeance, he will return as a lightning warrior to bring new glories to his homeland, new reasons for hatred to the wicked, and, God grant the wish, the final blow to the fleeing Austrian beyond the Alps. End. Note, won in 1831, while Garibaldi was in Taganrog, he found himself in an inn where many sailors from various parts of Italy were gathered. They discussed their painful experiences under humiliating conditions. Among them was a young man, the believer, to whom Garibaldi refers, who struggled to instill hopes of a happy and glorious future for the common homeland in the minds of his skeptical companions. Garibaldi listened attentively from the back of the room, and finally, unable to hold back any longer, he ran towards the unknown young man and, with the passion that clearly manifested his burning spirit, embraced him to his chest. It had been exactly 6 months since Garibaldi had been tasked by the government with the expedition to El Salto. From that day forward he became the heart's friend of that believer, who initiated him into the doctrines of young Italy. See from No. 911 to 16. See Core Live, the cited numbers, where this event is described in detail. 5. These words of the French admiral can only refer to the repeated calumnies against Italians published in French newspapers regarding the occupation of the colony, and particularly to articles appearing in La Presse, generally attributed to Messer. 6c. Rai Ponce Oxdaye Tractors de Montevideo Palm, Pacheco Wyobes, Paris 849. 7. Rai Ponce Oxdaye Tractors de Montevideo Palm, Pacheco Wyobes, previously cited, aid among the many who beautifully contributed to forming the necessary sum. Page, commander of the brig Duco, Dick, who was present at the time of the occupation, and fired upon the Italians instead of machine, gunning the enemies. Mr. Page is considered a partisan of Rosas in the Rio de la Plata. The French minister in Montevideo was Baron de Fordis. Stefano Antonini, a merchant from Gino, stood out, contributing the substantial amount of 30,000 lire and more to support the noble enterprise. The history of the Italian Legion in Montevideo should include a list of all contributors to that expedition. 9 among these, Francesco Gagini deserves special mention. After over 20 years away from his homeland, he gave up his well-established businesses to fight in Italy, accompanying Garibaldi until the moment when the Legion was disbanded in San Marino, and each had to provide for their own safety. 14v. Mazzini, Italia del Popolo, Vol. I. 23 January 1850, 4 years ago in North America, a novel titled Deleuze was published in which Garibaldi is given a noble role. 10a type of coat used in the campaigns of the countries of the Rio de la Plata and other places in South America. 11 Siege of Rome by B. Del Vecchio. 12 The French army numbered 40,000. The Italians only had around 12,000 regular troops. 13 It was said that the French consul in Tunis, in agreement with the Sardinian, made urgent requests to the Bey so that Garibaldi would be turned away, and that the latter then sent a person from the consulate on board the Tripoli with instructions to convey to Garibaldi that the consul had interceded with the government to grant him the desired hospitality. We recall this work by our friend Harrow Harring as an encomium for the author and Garibaldi. Note of the transcriber: the original spelling and punctuation have been preserved, with minor typographical errors corrected without annotation. End of the project Gutenberg e-book of Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi by Giovanni Battista Cuneo, Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography of Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by G.B. Cuneo, Deputato Deputy, Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Dalmaso, already in Favel in Dora-Grossa. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch. Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography di Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by Gibi, Cuneo, Deputato Deputy, Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Dalmaso, already in Favel in Dora-Grossa. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch. Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography di of Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by G.B. Cuneo, Deputato Deputy, Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Dalmaso, already in Favel in Dora-Grossa. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch. Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography of Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by G.B. Cuneo Deputato Deputy Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Damaso, already in Faval in Dora-Grossa. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy, more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch.
Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy, more thoughtful of himself. Petrarch.
Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography di of Joseph Garibaldi, compiled by G.B. Cuneo Deputato Deputy Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Dalmaso, already in Favel in Dora-Grossa.
First thing a minute lays away. Guess who guilty as shards come here? Biographia by Giuseppe Battista Biography Deputy Deputy Garibaldi come by Go DPP 50, permitting down by Fori and Dora-Grossa.
Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography de of Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by G.B. Cuneo Deputy Torino, Detto, 1850, printed by Fori and Dalmaso, already in Faval in Dora-Grossa. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy, more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch, Biographia di Giuseppe Garibaldi Cuneo, Gian Battista Biography di of Joseph Garibaldi, compilated by G.B. Cuneo Deputato Deputy Torino, 1850, printed by Fori and Dalmaso, already in Faval in Dora-Grossa. Joseph Garibaldi, you will see a knight who honours all of Italy, more thoughtful of others than of himself. Petrarch.